Chapter 15 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 15. As the pivot of events, Miss Lucilla Van Tromp was beginning to feel the responsibilities of her position. Only a woman with an inexhaustible heart could have met, as she did, the demands for sympathy, of various shades, made by the chief participants in the drama. While there was one phase of the action which called for a heroic display of conscience. It was impossible now to contemplate Marian Grimston's peril without a grave sense of the duties imposed by friendship. Some people might stand by and see a girl wreck her happiness by giving her heart to an unworthy suitor, but Miss Van Tromp was not among that number. It was, in fact, one of those junctures at which all her good instincts prompted her to say, "I ought to go and tell her." As a patriotic spinster, she held decided views on the question of marriage between American heiresses and impecunious foreign noblemen, and in her eyes all foreign noblemen were impecunious, in any case. But to see Marian Grimston become the victim of her parents' vulgar ambition gave to the subject a personal bearing which made her duty urgent. If ever there was a moment when a goddess and a machine could feel justified in descending for active intervention, it was now. She had the less hesitation in doing so, owing to the fact that she had known Marian since her cradle, and between the two there had always existed the subtle tie which not seldom binds the widely diverse but essentially like-minded together. Accordingly, on a bright May morning, within a few days of the last meeting between Derek Prune and Diane Eveleth, she sallied forth to the fashionable quarter where Mrs. Bayford dwelt, coming home, some 2 hours later, with a considerably extended knowledge of the possibilities inherent in human nature. The tale Miss Lucilla told was that which had already been many times repeated, each narrator lending to it the colour imparted by his own views of life. As now set forth, it became the story of a girl sought in marriage by a man who has inflicted mortal wrong upon an innocent young woman. With unconscious art, Miss Lucilla placed Marian Grimston herself in the centre of the piece, making the subsidiary characters revolve around her. This situation brought with it a double duty, the one explicit in righting the oppressed, the other implicit, for Miss Lucilla balked at putting it too plainly into words, in punishing a wicked marquis. The girl sat with head slightly bowed and rich colour deepening. If she showed emotion at all, it was in her haughty stillness, as though she voluntarily put all expression out of her face until the recital was ended. The effect on Miss Lucilla, as they sat side by side on a sofa, was slightly disconcerting, so that she came to her conclusion lamely. "Of course, my dear, I don't know his side of the story, or what he may have to say in self-defence. I'm only telling you what I've heard, and just as I heard it." "I dare say it's quite right." The brevity and suggested cynicism of this reply produced in Miss Lucilla a little shock. "Oh, then you think—" "There would be nothing surprising in it. It's the sort of thing that's always happening in Paris. It's one of the peculiarities of that society that you can never believe half the evil you hear of anyone, not even if it's told you by the man himself. I might go so far as to say that, when it's told you by himself, you're least of all inclined to credit it." "But how dreadful!" "Things are dreadful or not according to the degree in which you're used to them. I've grown up in that atmosphere, and so I can endure it. In fact, any other atmosphere seems to me to lack some of the necessary ingredients of air. Just as to some people, to Napoleon, for instance, a woman who isn't rouged isn't wholly dressed." "I know that's only your way of talking, dear. Oh, you can't shock me." "At any rate, the way of talking shows you what I mean. I can quite understand how Monsieur de Bienville might have said that of Mrs. Eveleth." Lucilla's look of pain induced Miss Grimston promptly to qualify her statement. "I said I could understand it. I didn't say I respected it. It's only what's been said of hundreds of thousands of women in Paris by hundreds of thousands of men, and in the place where they've said it, it's taken with the traditional grain of salt. If all had gone as it was going at the time, if the Eveleths hadn't lost their money, if Mr. Eveleth hadn't shot himself, if Mrs. Eveleth had kept her place in French society, the story wouldn't have done her any harm. People would have shrugged their shoulders at it and forgotten it. It's the transferring of the scene here, among you, that makes it grave. All your ideas are so different that what bad becomes worse by being carried out of its milieu. Monsieur de Bienville must be made to understand that, and repair the wrong. You seem to think there's no question but that there is a wrong. Oh, I suppose there isn't. There are so many cases of the kind. Mrs. Eveleth is probably neither more nor less than one of the many French women of her rank in life who liked to skate out on the thin edges of excitement, without any intention of going through. There are always women like my Aunt Bayford to think the worst of people of that sort, and to say it. And yet I don't see how that justifies Monsieur de Bienville. It doesn't justify, it only explains. Responsibility presses less heavily on the individual when it's shared. But wouldn't the person— you'll forgive me, my dear, won't you, if I'm going too far— wouldn't the person who has to take his part in that kind of responsibility be a doubtful keeper of one's happiness? Miss Grimston, half lowering her eyes, looked at her visitor with slumberous suspension of expression, and made no reply. If a man isn't good— Miss Lucilla began again tremblingly. No man is perfect. True, dear, and yet are there not certain qualities which we ought to consider as essentials? Monsieur de Bienville has those qualities for me. But surely, dear, you can't mean— Yes, I do mean. The avowal was made quietly, with the still bearing of one who gives a few drops of confession out of deep oceans of reserve. Miss Lucilla gazed at her in astonishment. That her parents should sacrifice her was not surprising, but that she should be willing to sacrifice herself went beyond the limits of thought. The revelation that Marian could actually love the man was so startling that it shocked her out of her timidity, loosening the strings of her eloquence and unsealing the sources of her maternal tenderness. There was nothing original in Miss Lucilla's subsequent line of argument. It was the old, oft-uttered, futile appeal to the head when the heart has already spoken. It premised the possibility of placing one's affections where one cannot give one's respect, regardless of the fact that the thing is done 1,000 times a day. It reasoned, it predicted, it implored, with an effect no more disintegrating on the girl's decision than moonbeams make upon a mountain. Through it all she sat and listened, with the veiled eyes and mysterious impassivity which gave to her personality a curiously incalculable quality, as of a force presenting none of the ordinary phenomena by which to measure or compute it. It was not until Miss Lucilla touched on the subject of honour that she obtained any sign of the effect she was producing. It was no more on Marian's part than an uneasy movement, but it betrayed its cause. Miss Lucilla pressed her point with renewed insistence, and presently 2 big tears hung on the long black lashes and rolled down. I should like to see Mrs. Eveleth. Like the hasty raising and dropping of a curtain on some jealously guarded view, the words gave to Miss Lucilla but a fleeting glimpse of what was passing in the obscure recesses of the girl's heart. But she determined to make the most of it by fixing there and then the day and hour when, without apparently forcing the event, the two might come face to face on the neutral ground of Gramercy Park. It was a meeting that, when it took place, would have been attended with embarrassment, had not both young women been practised in the ways of their little world. Progress in mutual understanding was made the easier by the existence, on both sides, of the European view of life, with its fusion of interests, its softness of outline, its give and take of toleration, in contradistinction to the sharp, clear insistence the American demands for a certain line of conduct and no other. 5 minutes had not gone by in talk before each found in the other's presence that sense of repose which comes from similar habits of thought and a common native idiom. Whatever grounds for difference they might find, they were at least ranged on the same side in that battle which the two hemispheres half unconsciously wage upon each other as to the main purposes of life. Thus they were able to approach their subject without that first preliminary shock which makes it difficult for races to agree. And thus, too, Marian Grimston found herself, before she was aware of it, pouring out to Dian Eveleth that heart which, in response to Miss Lucilla's tender pleading, had been dumb. They sat in the big, sombre library, where only a few days before Diane had seen Derek Prune turn his back on her without even a gesture of farewell. On the long mahogany table, the red azalea was in almost passionate luxuriance of blossom, while through the open window faint odours of lilac came from Miss Lucilla's bit of garden. "I don't want you to think him worse than you're obliged to," Marian said, as though in defence of the stand her heart had taken. "I've been told that very few men possess the two kinds of courage, the moral and the physical. Savonarola had the one, and Nelson had the other, but neither of them had both. And of the two, for me, the physical is the essential. I can't help it. If I had to choose between a soldier and a saint, I'd take to the soldier. When the worst is said of Monsieur de Bainville, it must be admitted that he's brave. I've always understood that he was a good rider and a good shot," Diane admitted. "I've no doubt that in battle he would conduct himself like a hero." The girl's head went up proudly, and from the languorous eyes there came one splendid flash before the lids fell over them again. "I know he would, and when a man has that sort of courage, he's worth saving." "You admit, then, that he needs to be saved?" Again the heavy lids were lifted for one brief searchlight glance. "Yes, I admit that. I believe he has wronged you. I can't tell you how I know it, but I do. It's to tell you so that I've asked you to come here. I hoped to make you see, as I do, that he's capable of doing it without appreciating the nature of his crime. If we could get him to see that—" "Then what?" "He'd make you reparation." "Are you so sure?" "I'm very sure. If he didn't—" The consequences of that possibility being difficult of expression, she hung upon her words. "I should be sorry to have you brought to so momentous a decision on my account." "It wouldn't be on your account. It would be on my own. I understand myself well enough to see that I could love a dishonourable man, but I couldn't marry him." "You have, of course, your own idea as to what makes a man dishonourable." "What makes a man dishonourable is to persist in dishonour after he has become aware of it. Anyone may speak thoughtlessly, or boastfully, or foolishly, and be forgiven for it. But he can't be forgiven if he keeps it up, especially when by his doing so a woman has to suffer." The movement with which Diane pushed back her chair and rose betrayed a troubled rather than an impatient spirit. "Miss Grimston," she said, standing before the girl and looking down upon her, "I should almost prefer not to have you take my affairs into your consideration. I doubt if they're worth it. I can't deny that I shrink from becoming a factor in your life, as well as from feeling that you must make your decisions or unmake them with reference to me." "I'm not making my decisions or unmaking them with reference to you. It's with reference to Monsieur de Bouilleville. He has my father's consent to his asking me to be his wife. I understand that, according to the formal French fashion, he's going to do it tomorrow. Before I give him an answer, I must know that he is such a man as I could marry." "You would have thought him so if you hadn't heard this about me." "Even so, it's better for me to have heard it. Any prudent person would tell you that. What I'm going to ask you to do now will not be for your sake, it will be for mine." "You're going to ask me to do something?" "Yes, to see Monsieur de Bienville." Diana recoiled with an expression of dismay. "I know it will be hard for you," Miss Grimston pursued, "and I wouldn't ask you to do it if it were not the straightest way out of a perplexing situation. I've confidence enough in him to believe that when he has seen you and heard your story, he'll act according to the dictates of a nature which I know to be essentially honourable, even if it's weak. You can see what that will mean to us all. It will not only clear you and rehabilitate him, but it will bring happiness to me." There was something in the way in which these brief statements were made that gave them the nature of an appeal. The very difficulty of the reserved heart in speaking out, the shame-flushed cheek, the subdued voice, the halting breath, had on Diana a more potent effect than eloquence. What was left of her own hope, too, at once put forth its claim at the possibility of getting justice. It was a matter of taking her courage in both hands in one tremendous effort. But the fact that this girl believed in her was a stimulus to making the attempt. Before they parted, with stammering expressions of mutual sympathy. She had given her word to do it. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 16. In the degree to which masculine good looks and elegance are accessories to impressing a maid's heart, the Marquis de Bienville had reason to be sure of the effect he was producing, as he bent and kissed Miss Marian Grimston's hand in her aunt's drawing-room on the following afternoon. He was not surprised to detect the thrill that shot through her being at his act of homage, and communicated itself back to him, for he was tolerably certain of her love. That had been, to all intents and purposes, confessed more than 2 years ago, while, during the intervening time, he had not lacked signs that the gift once bestowed had never been withdrawn. He had stood for a few seconds at the threshold on entering the room, just to rejoice consciously at his great good fortune. She had risen, but not advanced, to meet him, her tall figure sheathed in some close-fitting, soft stuff, thrown into relief by the dark blue velvet portière behind her. He was not unaware of his unworthiness in the presence of this superb young creature, and as he crossed the room, it was with the humility of a worshipper before a shrine. "Mademoiselle," he said simply when he had raised himself, "I come to tell you that I love you." The glance, slightly oblique, of suspended expression with which he received the words, encouraged him to continue. "I know how far what I have to give is beneath the honour of your acceptance, and yet when men love, they are impelled to offer all the little that they have. My one hope lies in the fact that a woman like you doesn't love a man for what he is, but for what she can make him." The words were admirably chosen, reaching her heart with a force greater than he knew. "A woman," she answered, with a certain stately uplifting of the head, "can only make a man that which she has already the power to become. She may be able to point out the way, but it's for him to follow it." "I don't think you'd see me hesitate at that." "I'm glad you say so, because the road I should have to ask you to take would be a hard one." "The harder the better, if it's anything by which I can prove my love." "It is, but it's not only that, it's something by which you could prove mine." His face brightened. "In that case, mademoiselle, speak." She took an instant to assemble her forces, standing before him with a calmness she did not feel. "You must forgive me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "if I take the initiative, as no girl is often called upon to do. Perhaps I should hesitate more if you hadn't told me, 2 years ago, what I know you've come to repeat today. The fact that I've waited those 2 years to hear you say it gives me a right that otherwise I shouldn't claim." He bowed. "There are no rights that a woman can have over a man which you, mademoiselle, do not possess over me." "Before telling me again," she continued, speaking with difficulty, "what you've told me already, I want to say that I can only listen to it on one condition." "Which is?" "That your own conscience is at peace with itself." There was a sudden startled toss of the head, but he answered bravely, "Is one's conscience ever at peace with itself? A woman's, perhaps, but a man's?" He shook his head with that wistful smile of contrition which is already a plea for pardon. "I'm not speaking of life in general, but of something in particular. I want you to understand, before you ask me what you've come to ask, that you couldn't make one woman happy while you're doing another a great wrong." He was sure now of what was in store for him, and braced himself for his part. He was one of those men who need but to see peril to see also the way of meeting it. He stood for a minute very straight and erect, like a soldier before a court-martial, a culprit whose guilt is half excused by his very manliness. "I have wronged women. They've wronged me too. All I can do is show I'm sorry for it is not to give them the same sort of offence again. I'm thinking of one woman in particular." He threw back his head with fine confidence. "I don't know her. It's Diane Eveleth. She says, I can imagine what she says. If I were you, I wouldn't pay it more attention than it deserves." "It deserves a great deal if it's true." "Not from you, mademoiselle. It belongs to a region into which your thought shouldn't enter." "My thought does enter it, I'm afraid. In fact, I think of it so much that I've invited Mrs. Eveleth to come here this afternoon. I hope you don't mind meeting her."
"Certainly not. Why should I?"
he demanded, with an air of conscious rectitude. Miss Grimston touched the bell. "Ask Mrs. Eveleth to come in," she said to the footman who answered it. As Diane entered, she greeted Bienville with a slight inclination of the head, which he returned, bowing ceremoniously. "I've begged Mrs. Eveleth to meet us," Marian hastened to explain, "for a very special reason." "Then perhaps you were good enough to tell me what it is," Bienville said, with a look of courteous inquiry. "Miss Grimston thought you might be able to help me." There was a catch in Diane's voice as she spoke, but she mastered it, keeping her eyes on his in an effort to be courageous.
"If there's anything I can do,"
he began, allowing the rest of his sentence to be inferred. He concealed his nervousness by placing a small gilded chair for Diane to sit on. He himself took a chair a few feet away, seating himself sidewise with his elbow supported on the back, in an easy attitude of attention. Marian Grimston withdrew to the more distant part of the room, where, with her hands behind her, she stood leaning against the grand piano, with the bearing of one only indirectly, and yet intensely, concerned. Bienville left the task of beginning to Diane. In spite of his determination to be self-possessed, a trace of compunction was visible in his face as he contrasted the subdued little woman before him with the sparkling, insouciant creature to whom, 2 or 3 years ago, he had paid his inglorious court. "I shall have to speak to you quite frankly and simply," Diane began, with some hesitation, still keeping her eyes on his. "Otherwise you wouldn't understand me."
"Quite so,"
Bienville assented politely. "You may not have heard that since my husband's death I have my own living to earn?"
"Yes, I did hear something of the kind."
"I've had what people in my position call a good situation, but I have lost it."
"Ah, I'm sorry."
"I thought you would be. That's why Miss Grimston asked me to tell you the reason. She was sure you wouldn't injure me knowingly."
"Naturally, I'm very much surprised that anyone should think I've injured you at all. To the best of my knowledge, your name has not passed my lips for 2 years at the least. If it had, it would only have been spoken with respect."
"I'm sure of that. I'm not pretending when I say that I'm absolutely convinced you're a man of sensitive honour. If you weren't, you couldn't be a Frenchman and a Bienville. I want you to understand that I've never attributed the things that happened to anything but folly and imprudence, for which I want to take my full share of the blame."
"I've never ventured to express to you my own regret," Bienville said, in a tone not free from emotion. "But I assure you it's very deep."
"No, all our life was so wrong. It's because I feel sure you must see that as well as I do that I'd hoped you'd help me now."
He said nothing in reply, letting some seconds pass in silence, waiting for her to come to her point.
"On the way up from South America," she began again, with visible difficulty, "you were on the same ship with my employer. From certain things you said then—"
"But I've withdrawn them," he interrupted quickly. "He should have told you that. Mademoiselle," he added, rising and turning towards Marian Grimston, "wouldn't it spare you if we continued this conversation alone?"
"No, I'd rather stay," Miss Grimston said, with an inflection of request. "Please sit down again."
"He should have told you that," Bienville repeated, taking his seat once more and speaking with some animation. "I did my best to straighten things out for him."
"Then he didn't understand you. He told me you had taken back what you had said, but only in a way that reaffirmed it."
"That's nothing but a tortuous construction put on straightforward words."
"Quite so. But for that very reason I thought that perhaps you'd go to him again and explain what you meant more clearly."
He took a minute to consider this before speaking. "I don't see how I can," he said slowly. "I've always used the plainest words of which I have command."
"Words aren't everything. It's the way they're spoken that often counts most. I'm sure you could convince him if you went the right way to work about it."
"Well, I doubt that. I'm afraid I don't know how to force conviction on anyone against his will."
"You mean
I mean, you'll excuse me, I speak quite bluntly. I mean that he seemed very willing to believe anything that could tell against you, but less eager to credit what was said in your defence. You think so because you don't understand him. As a matter of fact— Oh, I dare say. I don't pretend to understand the gentleman in question. But for that very reason it would be useless for me to try to enlighten him further. It would only make matters worse. It wouldn't if you put things before him just as they happen. I don't want any excuses made for me. My best defence would be the truth. There was a perceptible pause, during which his eyes shifted uneasily towards Marion Grimston. I should think you could tell him that yourself, he suggested at last. It wouldn't be the same thing. You're the only person who could speak with authority. He'd accept your word if you gave it in a certain way. I'm afraid I don't know what that way is. Oh, yes, you do, Bienville, she exclaimed pleadingly, leaning forward slightly, with her hands clasped in her lap. Don't force me to speak more plainly than I need. You must know what I refer to. He shook his head slowly with a look of mystification. What you may not know, she continued, is all it means to me. I won't put the matter on any ground but that of my need for earning money. Because Mr. Prune has misunderstood you, I've had to give up my place. She forced the last word with a little difficulty. And until something like a good name is restored to me, I shall find it hard to get another. You can have no idea of what that means. I had none until I had to face it. There's only one kind of work I'm fitted for, the kind I've been doing, but it's just the kind I can't have without the reputation you could give back to me. That this appeal was not without its effect was evident from the way in which his expressive brown eyes clouded while he stroked his black beard nervously. The fact that his pity was largely for himself, that with instincts naturally chivalrous he should be driven to these miserable verbal shifts, being unknown to Diane, she was encouraged to proceed. You see, she went on eagerly, it wouldn't only bring me happiness, but it would add to your own. You're at the beginning of a new life, just like me, or rather, just as I could be, if you give me the chance. Think what it would be for you to enter on it. I won't say with a clear conscience, but with the knowledge that in rising yourself you had helped an unhappy woman up, instead of thrusting her further down. It isn't as if it would be so hard for you, Bienville. I'd make it easy for you. Miss Grimston would help me, wouldn't you? She added, turning towards Marion. It could all be done quite simply and confidentially between ourselves and Mr. Prune. Oh, no, it couldn't, he said coldly. If I were to admit what you imply, secrecy wouldn't be of any use to me. Does that mean, she asked, fixing her earnest eyes upon him, that you don't admit it? It means, he said, rising quietly and standing behind his chair, that this conversation is extremely painful to me, and I must ask to be excused from taking any further part in it. I know only vaguely what you mean, madame, and if I don't inquire more in detail, it's because I want to spare you distressing explanations. I think you must agree with me, mademoiselle, he continued, looking towards Miss Grimston, that we should all be well advised in letting the subject drop. Marion came slowly forward, advancing to the side of Diane, over whose shoulder, as she remained seated, she allowed her hand to fall in a pose suggestive of protection. Of course, monsieur, she agreed. We must let the subject drop if you have nothing more to say. He stood silent a minute, looking at her steadily. I'm afraid I haven't, he said then. Nor I, Miss Grimston returned significantly. Again there was a minute or two of silence, during which Bienville seemed to probe for the meaning of the two laconic words. If anything could be read from his countenance, it was doubt as to whether to relinquish the prize with dignity, or to pay its price in humiliation. There was an instant in which he appeared to be bracing himself to do the latter, but when he spoke, his interrogation threw the responsibility for decision on Miss Grimston. Have I received my answer? She waited, finding it hard to give him his reply. It was as if forced to it against her will, that her head bent slowly in assent. Then, he said in a tone of dignified regret, there's nothing for me but to wish mademoiselle good-bye. He bowed separately to Miss Grimston and to Diane, and with the self-possession of a man accustomed to the various turns of drawing-room drama, he left the room. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 17. During the summer that followed these events, Derek Prune set himself the task of stamping the memory and influence of Diane Eveleth out of his life. His sense of duty combined with his feelings of self-respect in making the attempt. In reflecting on his last interview with her, he saw the weakness of the stand he had taken in it, recoiling from so unworthy a position with natural reaction. To have been in love at all at his age struck him as humiliation enough. But to have been in love with that sort of woman came very near mental malady. He said, "that sort of woman," because the vagueness of the term gave scope to the bitterness of resentment with which he tried to overwhelm her. It enabled him to create some such paradise of pain as that into which the souls of Othello and Desdemona might have gone together. Had he been a Moor of Venice, he would doubtless have smothered her with a pillow. But being a New York banker, he could only try to slay the image, whose eyes and voice had never haunted him so persistently as now. In his rage of suffering, he was as little able to take a reasoned view of the situation as the maddened bull in the arena to appraise the skill of his tormentors. When in the middle of May he had retired to Rhinefields, it was with the intention of laying waste all that Diane had left behind in the course of her brief passage through his life. The process being easier in the exterior phases of existence than in the more secret and remote, he determined to work from the outside inward. Wherever anything reminded him of her, he erased, destroyed, or removed it. All that she had changed within the house he put back into the state in which it was before she came. Where he had followed her suggestions about the grounds and gardens, he reversed the orders. Taken as outward and visible signs of the inward and spiritual change he was trying to create within himself, these childish acts gave him a passionate satisfaction. In a short time, he boasted to himself, he would have obliterated all trace of her presence. And so he came, in time, to giving his attention to Dorothea. She too bore the impress of Diane, and as she bore it more markedly than the inanimate things around, it caused him the greater pain. He could forbid her to hold intercourse with Diane and to speak of her, but he could not control the blending of French and Irish intonations her voice had caught, or the gestures into which she slipped through youth's mimetic instinct. In happier days he had been amused to note the degree to which Dorothea had become the unconscious copy of Diane. But now this constant reproduction of her ways was torture. Telling himself that it was not the child's fault, he bore it at first with what self-restraint he could. But as solitude encouraged brooding thoughts, he found, as the summer wore on, that his stock of patience was running low. There were times when some chanced sentence or imitated bit of mannerism on Dorothea's part almost drew from him that which in tragedy would be a cry, but which in our smaller life becomes the hasty or exasperated word. In these circumstances, the explosion was bound to come. And one day it produced itself unexpectedly and about nothing. Thinking of it afterward, Derek was unable to say why it should have taken place then more than at any other time. He was standing on the lawn, noting with savage complacency that the bit by which he had enlarged it at Diane's prompting had grown up again in luxuriant grass, when Dorothea descended the steps of the Georgian brick house behind him. "Would you be after wanting me today?" she called out, using the Irish expression Diane affected in moments of fun. "Dorothea," he cried sharply, wheeling round at her, "drop that idiotic way of speaking. If you think it's amusing, you're mistaken. You can't even do it properly." The words were no sooner out than he regretted them, but it was too late to take them back. Moreover, when a man, nervously suffering, has once wounded the feeling of one he loves, it is not infrequently his instinct to go on and wound them again. We have enough of that sort of language from the servants and the stable boys. Be good enough in future to use your mother tongue. Standing where his words had stopped her a few yards away, she looked up at him with the clear gaze of astonishment. The slight shrug of the shoulders before she spoke was also a trick caught from Diane, and not calculated to allay his annoyance. "Very well, father," she answered, with a quietness indicating judgment held in reserve. "I won't do it again. I only meant to ask you if you want me for anything in particular today. Otherwise I shall go over and lunch at the Thorogoods." "The Thorogoods again? Can't you get through a day without going there?" "I suppose I could if it was necessary, but it isn't." "I think it is. You do well not to wear out your welcome anywhere." "I'm not afraid of that." "Then I am, so you'd better stay at home." He wheeled from her as sharply as he had turned to confront her, striding off toward a wild border, where he tried to conceal the extent to which he was ashamed of his ill temper, by pretending to be engrossed in the efforts of a bee to work its way into a blue cowl of monkshood. When he looked round again, she was still standing where he had left her, her eyes clouded by an expression of wondering pain that smote him to the heart. Had he possessed sufficient mastery of himself, he would have gone back and begged her pardon and sent her away to enjoy herself. It was what he wanted to do, but the tension of his nerves seemed to get relief from the innocent thing's suffering. The very fact that her pretty little face was set with his own obstinacy of self-will, while behind it her spirit was rising against this capricious tyranny, goaded him into persistence. He remembered how often Diane had told him that Dorothea could be neither led nor driven, she could only be managed. But he would show Diane, he would show himself, that she could be both driven and led, and that management should go the way of the wall fruit and the roses. As, recrossing the lawn, he made as though he would pass her without further words, he was an excellent illustration of the degree to which the adult man of the world, capable of taking an important part among his fellow men, can be at times nothing but an overgrown infant. It was not surprising, however, that Dorothea should not see this aspect of his personality, or look upon his commands as other than those of an unreasonable despotism. "Father," she said, "I can't go on living like this." "Living like what?" "Living as we've lived all this summer." "What's the matter with the summer? It's like any other summer, isn't it?" "The summer may be like any other summer, but you're not like yourself. I do everything I can to please you, but—" "You didn't do anything to please me but what you're told." "I always do what I'm told, when you tell me, but you only tell me by fits and starts." "Then I tell you now, you're not to go to the Thorogoods." "But they expect me. I said I'd go to lunch. They'll think it very strange if I don't." "They'll think what they please. It's enough for you to know what I think." "But that's just what I don't know. Ever since Diane went away—" "Stop that! I've forbidden you to speak." "But you can't forbid me to think, and I think till I'm utterly bewildered. You don't explain anything to me. You haven't even told me why she went away. If I ask a question, you won't answer it." "What's necessary for you to know, you can depend on me to tell you. Anything I don't explain to you, you may dismiss from your mind." "But that's not reasonable, Father. It's not possible. If you want me to obey you, I must know what I'm doing. Because I don't know what I'm doing, I haven't—" "You haven't obeyed me?" he asked quickly. "Not entirely. I meant to tell you when an occasion offered, so I might as well do it now. I've written to Diane." "You've—" He strode up to her and caught her by the arm. It was not strange that she should take the curious light in his face for that of anger, but a more experienced observer would have seen that two distinct emotions crowded on each other. "I've written to her twice," Dorothea repeated defiantly as he held her arm. "She didn't reply to me, but I wrote." "What for?" "To tell her that I loved her, that no trouble should keep me from loving her, no matter what it was." He released her arm, stepping back from her again, surveying her with an admiration he tried to conceal under a scowling brow. The rigidity of her attitude, the lift of her head, the set of her lips, the directness of her glance, suggested not merely rebellion against his will, but the assertion of her own. It occurred to him that he could not break her little body to pieces before he could force her to yield. And in his pride in this temperament, so like his own, he almost uttered the cry of "brava" that hung on his lips. He might have done so if Dorothea had not found it a convenient moment of which to make all her confessions at once and have them off her mind. It was best to do it, she thought, now that her courage was up. "And, Father," she went on, "it may be a good opportunity to tell you something else. I've decided to marry Mr. Wappinger." During the brief silence that followed this announcement, he had time to throw the blame for it upon Diane, using the fact as one more argument against her. Had she taken his suggestions at the beginning and suppressed the Wappinger acquaintance, this distressing folly would have received a definite check. As it was, the odium of putting a stop to it, which must now fall on him, was but an additional part of the penalty he had to pay for ever having known her. So be it. He would make good the uttermost farthing. In doing it, he had the same sort of frenzied satisfaction as in defacing Diana's image in his heart. "You shall not," he said at last. "I don't understand how you're going to stop me." "I must ask you to be patient and see. You can make a beginning today by staying at home from the Thorogoods. That will be enough for the minute." Fearing to look any longer into her indignant eyes, he passed on towards the stables. For some minutes she stood still where he left her, while the collie gazed up at her with twitching tail and questioning regard, as though to ask the meaning of this futile hesitation. But when at last she turned slowly and re-entered the house, one would have said that the dainty rogue in porcelain had been transformed into an intensely modern little creature made of steel. She did not go to the Thorogoods that day, nor was any further reference made to the discussion of the morning. Compunction having succeeded irritation, with a rapidity not uncommon to men of his character, Derek was already seeking some way of reaching his end by gentler means, when a new move on Dorothea's part exasperated him still further. As he was about to sit down to his luncheon on the following day, the butler made the announcement that Miss Prune had asked him to inform her father that she had driven over in the pony cart to Mrs. Thorogood's and would not be home till late in the afternoon. He was not in the house when she returned, and at dinner he refrained from conversation till the servants had left the room. "So, it's war," he said, then speaking in a casual tone and toying with his wine-glass. "I hope not, Father," she answered promptly, making no pretence not to understand him. "It takes two to make a quarrel, and you wouldn't be one." "I was going to say that I hoped you wouldn't be." "But you yourself would fight?" "I should have to. I'm fighting for liberty, which is always an honourable motive. You're fighting to take it away from me." "Which is a dishonourable motive. Very well. I must accept that imputation as best I may, and still go on." "Oh, then it is war. You mean to make it so?" "I mean to do my duty. You may call your rebellion against it what you like." "I'm not accustomed to rebel," she said with significant quietness. "Only people who feel themselves weak do that." "And are you so strong?" "I'm very strong. I don't want to measure my strength against yours, Father, but if you insist on measuring yours against mine, I ought to warn you." "Thank you. It's in the light of a warning that I view your action today. You probably went to meet Mr. Wappinger." In saying this, his bow was drawn so entirely at a venture that he was astonished at the skill with which he hit the mark. "I did." He pushed back his chair, half rose, sat down again, poured out a glass of masala, drank it thirstily, and looked at her a second or two in helpless distress before finding words. "And you talk of honourable motives." "My motive was entirely honourable. I went to explain to him that I couldn't see him any more, just now." "While you were about it, you might as well have said neither just now nor at any other time." She was silent. "Do you hear?" "Yes, I hear, Father." "And you understand?" "I understand what you mean." "And you promise me that it shall be so?" "No, Father." "You say that deliberately. Remember, I'm asking you an important question, and you're giving me an equally important reply." "I recognise that, but I can't give you any other answer." "We'll see." He pushed back his chair again and rose. He had already crossed the room when, a new thought occurring to him, he turned at the door. "At least I presume I may count on you not to see this young man again without telling me." "Not without telling you. Afterward. I couldn't undertake more than that." Huh, he ejaculated, before passing out. Then I must take active measures. It was easier, however, to talk about active measures than to devise them. While Dorothea was sobbing, with her elbows on the dining-room table and her face buried in her hands, he was pacing his room in search of desperate remedies. It was a case in which his mind turned instinctively to Diane for help. But in the very act of doing so, he was confronted by her theories as to Dorothea's need of diplomatic guidance. For that, he told himself, the time was past. The event had proved how impotent mere management was to control her, and justified his own preference for force. Before she went to bed that night, Dorothea was summoned to her father's presence to receive the commands which should regulate her conduct towards the young man Wappinger. They could have been summed up in the statement that she must know him no more. She was not only never to see him, or write to him, or communicate with him, by direct or indirect means. As far as he could command it, she was not to think of him or remember his name. His measures grew more drastic in proportion as he gave them utterance, until he himself became aware that they would be difficult to fulfill. I will not attempt to extract a promise from you, he was prudent enough to say in conclusion, that you will carry out my wishes, because I know you would never bring on me the unhappiness that would spring from disobedience. It's hardly fair, father, to say that, she replied firmly. In war, no one should shrink from the misfortunes of war. That means, then, that you defy me? She was calmer than he as she made her reply. It doesn't mean that I defy you. I love you too much to put either you or myself in such an odious position as that. But it does mean that one day, sooner or later, I shall marry Mr. Wappinger. He looked at her with a bitter smile. I admire your frankness, Dorothea, he said after a brief pause, and I shall do my best to imitate it. If it's to be war, we shall at least fight in the open. I know what you intend to do, and you know that I mean to circumvent you. The position on both sides being so pleasantly clear, you may come and kiss me good night. During the process of the stiff little embrace that followed, it was as difficult for her not to fling herself sobbing on his breast, as for him not to seize her in his arms. But each maintained the restraint inspired by the justice of their respective causes. When she had closed the door behind her, he stood for a long time musing. That his thoughts were not altogether tragic became manifest as his brow cleared. The ghost of a smile, this time without bitterness, hovered about his lips. Suddenly he slapped his leg like a man who has made a discovery. By gad, he whispered half aloud, when all is said and done, she knows how to play the game. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 18. It was perhaps the knowledge that Dorothea could play the game that enabled Derek, during the rest of the summer, to play it himself. This he did without flinching, finding strength in the fact that, as time went on, Dorothea seemed to enter into his plans and submit to his judgment. The first few weeks of pallor and silence having passed, she resumed her accustomed ways, and, as far as he could tell, grew cheerful. Always having credited her with common sense, he was pleased now to see her make use of it in a way of which few girls of 19 would have been capable. She accepted his surveillance with so much docility that by the time they returned to town in the autumn, he was able to congratulate himself on his success. On her part, Dorothea carried out his instructions to the letter. Notwithstanding the opening of the season and the renewal of the usual gaieties, she lived quietly, accepting few invitations and rarely going into society at all, except under her father's wing. On those accidental occasions when Carly Wappinger came within their range of vision, it was only as a distant ship drifts into sight at sea, to drift silently away again. If Dorothea perceived him, she gave no sign. It was clear to Derek that her spurt of rebellion was over, and that her little experience had done her no harm. The name of Wappinger being tacitly ignored between them, he could only express his pleasure in the results he had achieved by an extravagant increase of Dorothea's allowance and gifts of inappropriate jewels. It would have taken a more weather-wise person than he to guess that behind this domestic calm the storm was brewing.
The first intuition of threatening events came to Mrs. Wappinger. "I've seen nothing and heard nothing," she declared in her emphatic way to Diane, "but I know something is going on." That was in September. They sat in the shade of the cool, flag-paved pergola at Waterwild, Mrs. Wappinger's place on Long Island. The tea-table stood between them, and they lounged in wicker chairs. Framed by marble pillars and festooned from above by vines drooping from the roof, there was a view of terraced lawns descending towards the sea. Between the slightly overcrowded urns and statues there were bright dashes of colour, here of dahlias in full bloom, there of reddening garlands of ampelopsis or Virginia creeper. It was what Mrs. Wappinger called an off day. Otherwise she would not have had Diane at Waterwild. In her loyalty toward the deserted woman, she seized those opportunities when Carly was away, and she was certain of having no other guests, to have the poor thing down for the day and give her a good meal. Not that people occupied themselves with Diane or her affairs. Her place in the hurrying, scrambling social throng had been so unobtrusive that now that she had no longer filled it, she was easily forgotten. Among the few who paid her the tribute of recollection, there was a generally received impression that Derek Prue, having discovered her relations with the Marquis de Vionville, relations which, so they said, had been well known in Paris in the days when she was still someone, had dismissed her from her position in his household. That was natural enough, and there was no further reason for remembering her. Having disappeared into the limbo of the unfortunate, she was as far beyond the mental range of those who retained their blessings as souls that have passed are out of sight of men and women who still walk the earth. For this very reason she called out in Mrs. Wappinger that motherly good nature which was only partially warped by the ambition for social success. On more than one of her off days she had lured Diane out of her refuge in University Place, treating her with all the kindness she could bestow without causing disparaging comment upon herself. On the present occasion she was the more desirous of her company because of the fact that, as she expressed it herself, she had sniffed something going on. "As I tell you," she repeated, "I've heard nothing and seen nothing. I've just sniffed it. If you were to ask me how, I couldn't explain it to you any more than I can say how I get the scent of this climbing heliotrope. But I do get it. I do know something is in the wind, more than what is told to you and I." "One can only hope that it will be nothing foolish," Diane murmured guardedly. "It will be something foolish," Mrs. Wappinger declared, "and you may take my word for it. Derek Prune can't arrogate to himself the powers of the Lord above any more than we can. If he thinks he can stop young blood from running, he'll find out he's wrong." It was the first mention of his name that Diane had heard in many weeks, and at the sound her hand trembled in such a way that she was obliged to put down untasted the cup she had half raised to her lips. "He's not an unkind man," she found voice to say. "He's only a mistaken one. He has one of those natures capable of dealing magnificently with great affairs, but helpless in the trivial matters of every day. He's like the people who see well at a distance, but become confused of the objects right under their eyes." "Then the farther you keep away from that man, the better the view he'll take of you. It's what I'd say to Carly if he asked for my advice." "Does that mean," Diane ventured to inquire, "that you don't want him to marry Dorothea?" "I certainly do not. If there were no other reason, she's the sort of girl to make me put one foot into the grave whether I want to or no. And it stands to reason that I don't want to be squelched 1 hour before my time." "Naturally. But I fancy you'd find her a sweeter girl than you might suppose." "So she may be, dear, but I've spent too much money on Carly to wish to see him force his way into a family where he isn't wanted." This was the text of Mrs. Wappinger's discourse, not only on the present occasion, but on the subsequent off days when Diane was induced to visit Waterwild. "Whatever is going on, Reggie Bradford's in it," she confided to Diane some few weeks later. "Is that the fat young man with the big laugh?" "Yes, and one of the greatest catchers in New York. Carly tells me he's wild about Marion Grimston, and I can see for myself that Mrs. Bayford is playing him against that Frenchman. She'll get the title if she can, but if not, she'll fall back on the money." "It's a pretty safe alternative," Diane smiled, making an effort to speak without betraying her feelings. "Reggie is a good-natured boy," Mrs. Wappinger pursued, "but a regular water-pipe. If you want to get anything out of him, you've only got to turn the faucet. It's just as well that he is, because whatever Carly is up to, Reggie knows. And what Reggie knows, Marian Grimston knows. If ever you see her—" "Oh, but I don't, not now." "That's a pity. If you did, you could pump her." "I'm afraid I'm not much good at that sort of thing." "Well, I am when I get a chance. I'm bound to find out somehow. And there are more ways of killing a cat than by giving it poison." A few weeks later still, Mrs. Wappinger informed Diane that Dorothea Prune was not happy. "The Thorogoods told the Louds," she explained, "and the Louds told me. Her father thinks she's given in to him, but she hasn't, not an inch. He keeps her like a jailer, and she acts like a convict, always with an eye open for some way of escape. That man no more understands women than he does making pie." "I've always noticed that the really strong men really do. There's almost invariably something petty about a man to whom a woman isn't a puzzle and a mystery." "If it comes to a puzzle and a mystery, I don't know where you'd find a greater one than Derek Prune himself, after the way he's acted and treated people." Diane flushed, but kept her emotions sufficiently under control to be able to follow her usual plan of straightforward speaking. "If you mean me, Mrs. Wappinger, I wanted to say that Mr. Prune has done nothing for which I can blame him. He was placed in a situation with which only a very subtle intelligence could have dealt, and I respect him the more for not having had it. It's generally the man who is most competent in his own domain who is most likely to blunder when he gets into the woman's. And I, for one, would rather have him do it. I've had to suffer because of it, and so has Dorothea. And yet that doesn't make me like it less." "No, I dare say not," Mrs. Wappinger responded sympathetically. "Mr. Wappinger himself was just such a man as that. He put through a deal that would make Wall Street shiver. But he understood my woman's nature just about as much as old Tiger there, wagging his tail on the grass, follows the stars in bonnets. Only I'll tell you what, Mrs. Edith, it's for men like that that God created sensible, capable wives like you and me, and they ought to have 'em." This scene admitting of little discussion, Diane did not pursue it, but she went away from Waterwild with a deepened sense of Derek's need of her, as well as of Dorothea's. She could so easily have helped them both that the enforced impotence was a new element in her pain. To walk the town in search of work to which she was little suited, when that which no one but herself could accomplish had to remain undone, became, during the next few weeks, the most intolerable part of the irony of circumstance. The wifely, the maternal qualities of her being, of which she had never been strongly conscious till of late, awoke in response to the need that drew them forth, only to be blighted by denial. The inactivity was the harder to endure because of the fact that, as autumn passed into early winter, there came a period when all her little world seemed to have dropped her out of sight. There were no more off-days at Waterwild, and Miss Lucilla's occasional letters from Newport ceased. Between her mother-in-law and herself, after a few painful attempts at intercourse, there had fallen an equally painful silence. Even her 2 or 3 pupils fell away. From the papers she learned that one or another of those for whom she cared was back in town again. She walked in the chief thoroughfares in the hope of meeting some of them, but chance refused to favour her. In the dusk of the early descending November and December twilights she passed their houses, watching the warm glow of the lights within, against which now and then a shadow that she could almost recognise would pass by. She could have entered at Miss Lucilla's door or Mrs. Wappinger's, but a strange shyness, the shyness of the unfortunate, had taken hold of her, and she held back. In the meantime she was free to watch, with sad eyes and sadder spirit, the great city, reversing the processes of nature, awaken from the torpor of the genial months into its winter life.
No one knew better than herself that thrill of excited energy with which those born with the city instinct return from the acquired taste for mountain, seaside, and farm, to enter once more the maze of purely human relationships. It was a moment with which her own active nature was in sympathy. She liked to see the blinds being raised in the houses and the barricading doors taken down. She liked to see the vehicles begin to crowd one another in the streets, and the pedestrians on the pavement wear a brisker air. She liked to see the shop windows brighten with colour, and the great public gathering spots let in and let out their throngs. She responded to the quickening animation with the spontaneity of one all ready to take her part, till the thought came that a part had been refused to her. It was with a curious sensation of being outside the range of human activities that, during those days of timid, futile looking for employment, she roamed the busy thoroughfares of New York. As time passed, she ceased to think much about her need of sympathetic fellowship in her anxiety to get work. She wrote advertisements and answered them. She applied at schools and offices and shops. She came down to seeking any humble drudgery which would give her the chance to live. It was not till one day in early December that the last flicker of her hope went out. Chance had made her pass at midday along the pavement opposite one of the great restaurants. Lifting her eyes instinctively towards the group of well-dressed people on the steps, she saw that Mrs. Bayford and Marianne Grimston were going in, accompanied by Reggie Bradford and the Marquis de Villeville. She had heard little or nothing of them during the last 4 empty months, but it was plain now that the lovers were agreed, and her own cause abandoned. Up to this moment, she had not realized how tenaciously she had clung to the belief that the proud, high-souled girl would yet see justice done her, and now she had deserted her, like the rest. For the first time during her years of struggle, she felt absolutely beaten so thoroughly that it would be useless to renew the fight. She had been on her way to see a lady who had advertised for a nursery governess, but she had no strength left with which to face the interview. In the winter garden of the restaurant, Mrs. Bayford was purring to her guests. Reggie Bradford was whispering to Miss Grimston, and the Marquis de Bienville was ordering the wines, while Diane was wandering blindly back to the poor little room she called her home, there to lie down and allow her heart to break. But hearts do not break at the command of those who own them, and when she had moaned away the worst of her pain, she fell asleep. When she awoke it was already growing dark, and the knocking at her door, which roused her, was like a call from the peace of dreams to the desolation of reality. When she had turned on the light, she received from the hands of the waiting servant that which had become a most rare visitant in the blackness of her life, a note. The address was in a sprawling hand which she recognized. What was written within was more sprawling still. For heaven's sake, come to me at once. The expected has happened, and I don't know what to do. The motor will wait and bring you. Clara Wappinger. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 19. As Diane entered, Mrs. Wappinger, dishevelled and distraught, was standing in the hall, a slip of yellow paper in her hand. "Oh, my dear, I'm so glad you've come. I'm just about crazy. Read this." Diane took the paper and read it. "Dee and I are to be married tonight. Be ready to receive us tomorrow. Carly." "When did this come?" Diane asked quickly. "About half an hour ago. I sent for you at once." "I see it's dated from Lakefield. Where's that?" Mrs. Wappinger explained that Lakefield was a small winter health resort some 2 hours by train from New York. She and Carly had stayed there more than once at the Bay Tree Inn. He would naturally go to the same hotel, only when she had telephoned to it a few minutes ago, she could find no one of the name in residence. Under the circumstances, Diane suggested, he would probably not give his name at all. There followed a few minutes of silent reflection, during which Mrs. Wappinger gazed at Diane
and the half-tearful helplessness of one not used to coping with unusual situations. "Won't you come and sit down?" she asked, with a sudden realization that they were still standing beneath the light in the hall. "No," Diane answered with decision. "It isn't worth while. May I have the motor for an hour or so?" "Why, certainly. But where are you going?" "I'm going first to Mr. Prune's, and afterwards to Lakefield." "To Lakefield? Then I'll go with you. We could go in the car." Diane negatived both suggestions. The motor might break down, or the chauffeur might lose his way. The train would be safer. If anyone went with her, it would have to be Mr. Prune. "But don't go to bed," she added, "or at least have someone to answer the telephone, for I'll ring you up as soon as I have news for you." "God bless you, dear," Mrs. Wappinger murmured. "I know you'll do your best for me and them. Keep the auto as long as you like, and if you decide to go down on it, just say so to Laporte." But Diane seemed to hesitate before going. A flush came into her cheek, and she twisted her fingers in embarrassment. "I wonder," she faltered, if you could let me have a little money. I shall need some, and I haven't any." "Oh, my dear, my poor dear." Mrs. Wappinger bustled away, crumpling the notes she found in her desk into a little ball, which she forced into Diane's hand. To forestall thanks, she thrust her towards the door, accompanying her down the steps, and kissing her as she entered the automobile. "Why, bless me heart, if it ain't the madam." This outburst was a professional solecism on the part of Fulton, the English butler at Derrick Prune's, but it was wrung from him in sheer joy at Diane's unexpected appearance. "You'll excuse me, ma'am," he continued, recapturing his air of decorum, "but I fair couldn't help it. We'll be awful pleased to see you, ma'am, if I may make so bold as to say it, right down to the cat. It hasn't been the same house since you went away, ma'am, and me and Mr. Simmons have said so time and time again. You'll excuse me, ma'am, but—" "You're very kind, Fulton, and so is Simmons, but I'm in a great hurry now. Is Mr. Prune at home?" "Why, no, he ain't, ma'am, and that's a fact. He's to dine out." "Where?" "Oh, I couldn't tell you that, ma'am. But perhaps Mr. Simmons would know. He took Mr. Prune's evening clothes to the bank, and he was to change there. If you wait a minute, ma'am, I'll ask him." But when Simmons came, he could only give the information that his master was going to a sort of business banquet at one of the great restaurants or hotels. Moreover, Miss Dorothea had gone out, saying that she would not be home to dinner. "Then I must write a note," Diane said, with that air of natural authority which had seemed almost lost from her manner. "Will you, Fulton, be good enough to bring me a glass of wine and a few biscuits when I write? I must ask you, Simmons, for a railway guide." In Derrick's own room, she sat down at the desk where, 6 months ago, she had arranged his letters on the night when he had returned from South America. She had no time to indulge in memories, but a tremor shot through her frame as she took up the pen and wrote on a sheet of paper which she had already headed with a date. "I have bad news for you, but I hope I may be in time to keep it from being worse. I have reason to think that Dorothy has gone to Lakefield to be married there to Carly Wappinger. Should there be any mistake, you will forgive me for disturbing you, but I think it well to be prepared for extreme possibilities. I am therefore going to Lakefield now, at once. A train at 7:15 will get there a little after 9. There are other trains through the evening, the latest being at 5 minutes after 10. Should this reach you in time to enable you to take one of them, you will be wise to do so. But in case it may be too late, you may count on me to do all that can be done. Let someone be ready to answer the telephone all night. I shall communicate with the house from the Bay Tree Inn. I must ask you again to forgive me if I am interfering rashly in your affairs, but you can understand that I have no time to take counsel or reflect. Diane Evelyn." Having made a copy of this letter, she called Simmons and Fulton and gave them their instructions. There had been an accident, she said, of which she had been able to get only imperfect information, but it seemed possible that Miss Dorothea was involved in it. She herself was hurrying to Lakefield, and it would be Simmons' task to find Mr. Prune in time for him to catch the 10:05 train at latest. He was to pack 2 valises with all that Mr. Prune could require for a change. He was to take one of the 2 letters and one of the 2 valises, and go from place to place until he tracked his master down. Fulton was to say nothing to alarm the other servants, merely informing Miss Dorothea's maid that the young lady was absent for the night and that Mrs. Eagles was with her. He would take charge of the 2nd letter and the 2nd valise in case Mr. Prune should return to the house before Simmons could find him.
The important charge of the telephone was also to be in Fulton's trust, and he was to answer all calls through the night. In concluding her directions, Diane acknowledged her relief in having two lieutenants on whose silence, energy, and tact she could so thoroughly depend. She committed the matter to their hands not merely as to Mr. Prune's butler and valet, but as to his trusted friends, and in that capacity she was sure they would do their duty and hold their tongues. In a similar spirit, when she arrived about 9:30 at the Bay Tree Inn, she asked for the manager and took him into her confidence. A runaway marriage, she informed him, had been planned to take place that very night at Lakefield, and she had come there as the companion and friend of a motherless girl, her object being to postpone the ceremony. The manager listened with sympathy and promised his help. As a matter of fact, a gentleman had arrived, driving his own motor, that very afternoon. He had put the machine in the garage and taken a room, but had not yet registered. Their season having scarcely begun and the hotel being empty, they were somewhat careless about such formalities. He could only say that the young man was tall, fair, and slender, and seemed to be a person of means. He believed, too, that at this very minute he was smoking on the terrace before the door. If Diane had not come up by another way, she must have met him. She could step out on the terrace and see for herself whether it was the person she was looking for or not. Being tolerably sure of that already, Diane preferred to complete her arrangements first. She would ask for a room as near as possible to the main door of the hotel, so that when the young lady arrived she could be ushered directly into it. Fortunately, the establishment was able to offer her exactly what she required, one of the invalid suites which were a special feature of the house, a little sitting-room and bedroom for the use of persons whose infirmities made a long walk between their own apartments and the sun parlour inadvisable. Having inspected and accepted it, Diane bathed her face and smoothed her hair, after which she stepped out to confront Mr. Wappinger. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 20. She saw him at the end of the terrace, peering through the moonlight down the driveway. She did not go forward to meet him, but waited until he turned in her direction. She knew that, at a distance, and especially at night, her own figure might seem not unlike Dorothea's, and calculated on that effect. She divined his state of astonishment on catching sight of her by the abrupt jerk of his head and the way in which he half threw up his hands. When he began coming forward, it was with a slow, interrogative movement, as though he were asking how she had come there, in disregard of their preconcerted signals. Some exclamation was already on his lips, when, by the light streaming from the windows of the hotel, he saw his mistake and paused. "Good evening, Mr. Wappinger. What an extraordinary meeting." Priding himself on his worldly wisdom, Carly Wappinger never allowed himself to be caught by any trick of feminine finesse. On the present occasion he stood stock still and silent, eyeing Diane as a bird eyes a trap before hopping into it. Though he knew her as a friend to Dorothea and himself, he knew her as a subtle friend, hiding under her sympathy many of those kindly devices which experience keeps to foil the young. He did not complain of her for that, finding it legitimate that she should avail herself of what he called the stock-in-trade of a chaperone, while it had often amused him to outwit her. But now it was a matter of Greek meeting Greek, and she must be given to understand that he was the stronger. How she had discovered their plans he did not stop to think, but he must make it plain to her that he was not duped into ascribing her presence at Lakefield to an accident. "Is it an extraordinary meeting, Mrs. Heathcliff, for you?" "No, not for me," Diane replied readily. "I only thought it might be for you." "Then I'll admit that it is." "But I hoped, too," she continued, moving a little nearer to him, "that my coming might be in the way of a pleasant surprise." "Oh, yes, certainly, very pleasant indeed." "I'm a good deal relieved to hear you say that, Mr. Wappinger," she said, "because there was a possibility that you mightn't like it." "Whether I like it or not," he said wearily, "will depend upon your motive." "I don't think you'll find any fault with that." I came because I thought I could help Dorothea. I hoped I might be able indirectly to help you, too. What makes you think we're in need of help? She came near enough for him to see her smile. Because until after you're married, you'll both be in an embarrassing position. There are worse things in the world than that. Not many. I can hardly imagine two people like Dorothea and yourself more awkwardly placed than you'll be from the minute she arrives. Remember, you're not Strephon and Chloe in a pastoral. You're two most sophisticated members of a most sophisticated set. You scarcely know how to walk about excepting according to the rules of a code of etiquette. Neither of you was made for escapade, and I'm sure you don't like it any more than she will. And so you've come to relieve the situation? Exactly. And for anything else? What else could I come for? You might have come for 2 or 3 things. One of which would be to interfere with your plans. Well, I haven't. If I wanted to do that, I could have done it long ago. I'll tell you outright that Mr. Prune requested me more than once to put a stop to your acquaintance with Dorothea, and I refused. I refused at first because I didn't think it wise, and afterward because I liked you. I kept on refusing because I came to see in the end that you were born to marry Dorothea, and that no one else would ever suit her. I'm here this evening because I believe that still, and I want you to be happy. Did you think your coming would make us happier? In the long run, yes. You may not see it tonight, but you will tomorrow. You can't imagine that I would run the risk of forcing myself upon you unless I was sure there was something I could do. Well, what is it? It isn't much, and yet it's a great deal. When you and Dorothea are married, I want to go with you. I want to be there. I don't want to go friendless. When she goes back to town tomorrow and everything has to be explained, I want to be able to say that I was beside her. I know that mine is not a name to carry much authority, but I'm a woman who has held a position of responsibility, almost a mother's place, towards Dorothea herself. And there are moments in life when any kind of woman is better than none at all. You may not see it just now, but— Oh, yes, I do, he said slowly. Only when you've gone in for an unconventional thing, you might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. I don't agree with you. Nothing more than the unconventional requires a nicely discriminating taste, and it's no use being more violent than you can help. You and Dorothea are making a match that sets the rules of your world at defiance, but you may as well avail yourselves of any little mitigation that comes to hand. Life is going to be hard enough for you as it is. Oh, I don't know about that. They can't do anything to us. Not to you, perhaps, because you're a man, but they can't to Dorothea, and they will. This is just one of those queer situations in which you'll get the credit and she'll get the blame. You can always make a poem on young Lochinvar when it's less easy to approve of the damsel who springs to the pillion behind him. I don't pretend to account for this idiosyncrasy of human nature. I merely state it as a fact. Society will forget that you ran away with Dorothea, but it will never forget that she ran away with you. Ah! But I don't see that need distress you. You wouldn't care. And as for Dorothea, she's got the pluck of a soldier. Depend upon it, she sees the whole situation already, and is prepared to face it. That's part of the difference between a woman and a man. You can go into a thing like this without looking ahead, because you know that, whatever the opposition, you can keep it down. A woman is too weak for that. She must count every danger beforehand. Dorothea has done that. This isn't going to be a leap in the dark for her. It would be for any girl of her intelligence and social instincts. She knows what she's doing, and she's doing it for you. She has made her sacrifice and made it willingly before she consented to take this step at all. She's crossed her Rubicon without saying anything to you about it, and you needn't consider her any more. Well, I like that, he said, in an injured tone, thrusting his hands into his overcoat pockets and beginning to move along the terrace. Yes, I thought you would, she agreed, walking by his side. It shows what she's willing to give up for you. It shows even more than that. It shows how she loves you. Dorothea is not a girl who holds society lightly, and if she renounces it— Oh, but come now, Mrs. Eveleth, it isn't going to be as bad as that. It isn't going to be as bad as anything. Bad is not the word. When I speak of renouncing society, of course I only mean renouncing the best. There will always be some people too. Well, you remember Dumas' comparison of the sixpenny and the 6-shilling peaches. If you can't have the latter, you will be able to afford the former. They walked on in silence to the end of the terrace, and it was not till after they had turned that the young man spoke again. I believe you're overdrawing it, he said with some decision. Isn't it you who are overdrawing what I mean? I'm simply trying to say that while things won't be very pleasant for you, they won't be worse than you can easily bear, especially when Dorothea has steeled herself to them in advance. I repeat, too, that, poor as I am, my presence will be taken as safeguarding some of the proprieties people expect one to observe. I speak of my presence, but after all, you may have provided yourself with someone better. I didn't think of that. No, there's no one. Then Dorothea is coming all alone? Reggie Bradford is bringing her, if you want to know. By the 10:05 train? No, in his motor. How very convenient these motors are. And has she no companion but Mr. Bradford? She hasn't any companion at all. She doesn't even know that the man driving the machine is Reggie. He thought that, going very slowly, as he promised to do, to avoid all chances of accident, they might arrive by 11. And Dorothea was to be alone here with you 2 men? Well, you see, we are to be married as soon as she arrives. We go straight from here to the clergyman's house. He's waiting for us. In 10 minutes' time I shall be her husband, and then everything will be all right. How cleverly you've arranged it. I had to make my arrangements pretty close, Carly explained in a tone of pride. There were a good many difficulties to overcome, but I did it. Dorothea has had no trouble at all, and will have none. That is, he added with a sigh at the recollection of what Diana had just said, as far as getting down here is concerned. She went to tea at the Belfords, and on coming out she found a motor waiting for her at the door. She walked into it without asking questions and sat down, and that's all. She doesn't know whose motor it is or where she's going, except that she's been taken toward me. I provided her with everything. She's got nothing to do but sit still till she gets here, when she will be married almost before she knows she's arrived. It's certainly most romantic, and if one has to do such things, they couldn't be done better. Well, one has to sometimes. Yes, so I see. What do you suppose Derek Prune will say? He asked, after a brief pause. I haven't the least idea what he'll say in these circumstances. Of course, I always knew, but there's no use speaking about that now. Speaking about what now? He asked sharply. Oh, nothing. One must be with Mr. Prune constantly, live in his house, to understand him. You can always count on his being kinder than he seems at first, or on the surface. During the last months I was with Dorothea, I could see plainly enough that in the end she would get her way. He paused abruptly in his walk and confronted her. Then for heaven's sake, he demanded, why didn't you tell me that before? You never asked me. I couldn't go round shouting it out for nothing. Besides, it was only my opinion, in which, after all, I am quite likely to be wrong. But quite likely to be right? I suppose so. Naturally, I should have told you, she went on humbly, if I thought that you wanted to hear, but how was I to know that? One doesn't talk about other people's private affairs unless one is invited. In any case, it doesn't matter now. A man who can cut the Gordian knot as you can doesn't care to hear that there's a way by which it might have been unravelled. I'm not so sure about that. There are cases in which the longest way round is the shortest way home, and if— But I didn't suppose you would consider so cautious a route as that. I shouldn't for myself, but you see, I have to think of Dorothea. But I've already told you that there's no occasion for that. If Dorothea has made her choice with her eyes open— Good Lord, he cried impatiently, you'd take it as if all I wanted was to get her into a noose. Well, isn't it? Perhaps I'm stupid, but I thought the whole reason for bringing her down here was because we thought there was no other way, he finished in a tone of exasperation. But if there is another way— I'm not at all sure that there is. she retorted with a touch of asperity to keep pace with his rising emotion. Don't begin to think that because I said Mr. Prune was coming round to it, he's obliged to do it. No, but if there was a chance. Of course there's always that. But what then? Well, then there'd be no particular reason for rushing the thing tonight, but I don't know, though, he continued with a sudden change of tone. We're here, and perhaps we might as well go through with it. All I want is her happiness, and since she can't be happy in her own home— Diane laughed softly. He stopped once more in his walk to look down at her. There's one thing you ought to understand about Dorothea, she said with a little air of amusement. You know how fond I am of her, and that I wouldn't criticize her for the world. Now don't be offended, and don't glower at me like that, for I must say it. Dorothea isn't unhappy because she hasn't a good home, or because she has a stern father, or because she can't marry you. She's unhappy because she isn't getting her own way, and for no other reason whatever. She's the dearest, sweetest, most loving little girl on earth, but she has a will like steel. Whatever she sets her mind on, great or small, that she is determined to do, and when it's done, she doesn't care any more about it. When I was with her, I never crossed her in anything. I let her do what she was bent on doing, right up to the point where she saw, herself, that she didn't want to. If her father would only treat her like that, she wouldn't be coming down here tonight. That's what you mean, isn't it? Oh, no, how can you say so? I can say so because I think there's a good deal of truth in it. I'm not without some glimmer of insight into her character myself, and to be quite frank, it was seeing her set her pretty white teeth and clench her fist and stamp her foot to get her way over nothing at all first made me fall in love with her. Then I will say no more. I see you know her as well as I do. Yes, I know her, he said confidently, marching on again. I don't think there are many corners of her character into which I haven't seen. Several remarks arose to Diane's lips, but she repressed them, and they continued their walk in silence. During the 3 or 4 turns they took, side by side, up and down the terrace, she divined the course his thought was taking, and her speech was with his inner rather than his outer man. Suddenly he stopped with one of his jerky pauses, and when he spoke his voice took on a boyish quality that made it appealing. Mrs. Edith, do you know what I think? I think that you and I have come down here on what looks like a fool's business. If it wasn't for leaving Dorothea here with Reggie Bradford, I'd put you in the motor, and we'd travel back to New York as fast as tires could take us. Upon my word, she confessed, you make me almost wish we could do it. But of course it isn't possible. There must be someone here to meet Dorothea and explain. I could do that if you liked. Oh, no, he exclaimed with a new change of mind. I should look as if I was showing the white feather. On the contrary, you look as if you knew what it was to be a man. And Derek Prune might hold out against me in the end. It would be time enough even then to do what you meant to do tonight, and I'd help you. He hesitated still, till another thought occurred to him. Oh, what's the good? It's too late to rectify anything now. They must know at her house by this time that she's gone to meet me. No, I've anticipated that. They understand that she's here at the Bay Tree Inn with me. He moved away from her with a quick backward leap. With you? You've done that? You've seen them? You've told them? You're a wonderful woman, Mrs. Edith. I see now what you've been up to, he added with a shrill, nervous laugh. You've been turning me round your little finger, and I'm hanged if you haven't done it very cleverly. You failed in this one point, however, that you haven't done it quite cleverly enough. I stay. Very well, but you won't refuse to let me stay too, for the reasons that I gave you at first. You're wily, I must say. If you can't get best, you're willing to take second best, isn't that it? That's it exactly. I did hope that no marriage would take place between Dorothea and you tonight. I hoped that before you came to that, you realized to what a degree you're taking advantage of her wilfulness and her love for you, for it's a mixture of both, to put her in a false position, from which she'll never wholly free herself as long as she lives. I hoped you'd be man enough to go back and win her from her father by open means. Failing all that, I hoped you'd let me blunt the keenest edge of your folly by giving to your marriage the countenance which my presence at it could bestow. Was there any harm in that? Was there anything for you to resent, or for me to be ashamed of? Is a good thing less good because I wish it, or a wise thought less wise because I think it? You talk of turning you round my little finger as though it was something at which you had to take offence. My dear boy, that only shows how young you are. Every good woman, if I may call myself one, turns the men she cares for round her little finger, and it's the men who are worth most in life who submit most readily to the process. When you're a little older, when perhaps you have children of your own, you'll understand better what I've done for you tonight, and you won't use towards my memory the tone of semi-jocular disdain that has entered into nearly every word you've addressed to me this evening. Now, if you'll excuse me, she added wearily, I think I'll go in. I'm very tired, and I'll rest till Dorothea comes. When she arrives, you must bring her to me directly, and she must stay with me till I take her to the wedding. My room is the first door on the left of the main entrance. She was halfway across the terrace when he called out to her, the boyish tremor in his voice more accentuated than before. Wait a minute. There's lots of time. She came back a few paces towards him. Shouldn't I look very grotesque if I hooked it? Not half so grotesque as you'll look tomorrow morning when you have to go back to town and tell everyone you meet that you and Dorothea Prune have run away and got married. That's when you'll look foolish and cut a pathetic figure. As things are, it could be kept between 2 or 3 of us. But if you go on, you'll be in all the papers by tomorrow afternoon. Of course your mother knows. I suppose so. I wired when I thought it was too late for her to spread the alarm. But I don't mind about her. She'll be only too glad to have me back at any price. Then I'd go. The light from the hotel was full on his face, and she could almost have kissed him for his doleful, crestfallen expression. Well, I will. There was no heroism in the way in which he said the words, and the spring disappeared from his walk as he went back to the hotel to pay his bill and order out his machine. Diane smiled to herself to see how his head drooped and his shoulders sagged, but her eyes blinked at the mist that rose before them. After all, he was little more than a schoolboy, and he and Dorothea were but 2 children at play. She did not continue her own way into the hotel. Now that the first part of her purpose in coming had been accomplished, she was free to remember what the comedy with Kai had almost excluded from her mind, that within an hour or 2, Derek Prune and she might be face to face again. The thought made her heart leap as with sudden fright. Fortunately, Dorothea would have arrived by that time, and would stand between them. Otherwise the mere possibility would have been overwhelming. Yes, Dorothea ought to be coming soon. She looked at her watch and found it was nearly 11. On the stillness of the night there came a sound, a clatter, a whiz, a throb, the unmistakable noise of an automobile. She hurried to the end of the terrace, but it was not Dorothea coming. It was Carly going away. She breathed more freely, standing to see him pass, and knowing that he was really gone. A minute later he went by in the moonlight, waving his hand to her, as she stood silhouetted on the terrace above him. Then, to her annoyance, the motor stopped, and he leaped out. For a moment her heart stood still in alarm, for if he was coming back, the work might be to do all over again. He did not come back, scrambling up the steps till he was at her feet. But it was only to seize her hand and kiss it hastily, after which, without a word, he was off again. Then once more the huge machine clattered and whizzed and throbbed, rattling its way down the drive and on into the dark, till all sound died away into the solemn winter silence. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 21. During the next half hour, small practical tasks occupied Diane's mind and kept the thought of Derek Prune's arrival from becoming more than a subconscious dread. She informed the manager of her success with his mysterious young guest, and arranged that Dorothea, when she came, should spend the night with her. Then she put herself in telephonic communication, first with Mrs. Wappinger, and then with Fulton. She gave the informer the intelligence that Carley had departed, and received from the latter the information that Simmons had found his master, who had been able to leave for Lakefield by the 10:05 train. These steps being taken, there was nothing to do but to sit down and wait for Dorothea. Allowing 30 or 40 minutes for possible delays, she calculated that the girl ought to arrive a good half-hour before her father. This would give her time to deal with each separately, clearing up misunderstandings on both sides, and preparing the way for such a meeting as would lead to mutual concessions and future peace. Physically tired, she took off her hat and threw herself on the couch in her little sitting-room. By sheer force of will, she continued to shut out Derek from her thought, concentrating all her mental facilities on the arguments and persuasions she should bring to bear on Dorothea. She had no nervousness on this account. The naughty, headstrong child that runs away from home does not get far without a realizing sense of its happy shelter. She divined that the long ride through the dark with an unknown man toward an unknown goal would have already subdued Dorothea's spirits to the point where she would be only too glad to find herself dropping into familiar feminine arms. At 11 o'clock she got up from her couch with a vague impulse to be in a more direct attitude of welcome. At 11:30 she went to the office to inquire of the manager how long a motor going slowly should take to reach Lakefield from New York, assuming that it had got away from the city about 6 o'clock. Alarmed by his reply, she begged him to keep a certain number of the servants up, and the hotel in readiness to cope with any emergency or accident, promising liberal remuneration for all unusual work. After that came another long hour of waiting. It was 12:30 when there was a sound of a carriage coming up the driveway. It was probably Derek, and yet there was a possibility that, the automobile having broken down, Reggie and Dorothea had been obliged to finish their journey in a humbler way than that in which they had started. Diane hurried to the terrace. The moon had disappeared, but the stars were out, and the night had grown colder. The pines surrounding the hotel shot up weirdly against the midnight sky, soughing with a low murmur like the moan of a primeval nature. Up the ascent from the main road the carriage crept wearily, while Diane's heart poured itself out in a sort of incoherent prayer that Dorothea might have arrived before her father. The horses dragged themselves to the steps, and Derek Prune sprang out. Instinctively Diane fell back. "Oh, it's you!" she gasped, unable for the instant to say more. "Yes," he returned quickly, peering down into her face. "What news?" "Dorothea hasn't come. The other person has gone."
"Gone? How gone?"
"He went away of his own accord."
"That is, you sent him?"
"Not exactly. He was willing to go. He saw he'd been doing wrong." A porter having come from the hotel and seized Derek's valise, it was necessary for them to go in and attend to the small preliminaries of arrival. When they were finished, Derek returned to Diane, who had seated herself in a wicker chair beside one of the numerous tea tables to which a large part of the hall was given up. Under the eye of the drowsy clerk, who still kept his place at the office desk, she felt a certain sense of protection, even though the width of the hotel lay between them. "Now tell me," Derek said in his quick, commanding tones. "Tell me everything." The repressed intensity of his bearing had on Diane the effect of making her more calmly mistress of herself. Quietly, and in a manner as matter-of-fact as she could make it, she told her tale from the beginning. She narrated her summons from Mrs. Wappinger, her visit to his own house, her arrangements there, her journey to Lakefield, and her interview with Carley Wappinger. Without making light of what he and Dorothea had undertaken to do, she reduced their faults to a minimum, turning it into indiscretion rather than anything more grave. She laid stress on the excellence of the young man's character, as well as on the promptness with which he had relinquished his part in the plan as soon as he saw its true nature. In spite of himself, Derek began to think of the lad as of one who had sprung to his help in a moment of need, and to whom he was indebted for a service. Not until Diane ceased speaking was he able to brush this absurd impression away, in the knowledge that Dorothea, who should have arrived nearly 2 hours ago, was still out in the dark. That, for the moment, was the one fact to which everything else was subordinate. "I can't understand it," he said nervously. "If they left New York by 6 or even 7, they should have been here by 11 at the latest. That would have given them time for slow going or taking a circuitous route." He rose nervously from his seat, interviewed the clerk at the desk, went out on the terrace, listened in the silence, walked restlessly up and down, and, returning to Diane, enumerated the different possibilities that would reasonably account for the delay. Glad of this preoccupation, since it diverted thought from their more personal relations, she pointed out the wisdom of accepting whatever explanation was least grave, until they knew the certainty. When he had gone out several times more to listen on the terrace, he came back, and resuming his seat, said brusquely, "You look tired. You ought to get some rest." The tone of intimate care reached Diane's heart more directly than words of greater import. "I would," she said simply. "That is, I'd go to my room if I thought you'd be kind to Dorothea when she came."
"And don't you think so?"
"I think you'd want to be," she smiled, "if you knew how."
"But I shouldn't know how."
"You see, it's a situation that calls directly for a woman, and you're so essentially a man. When Dorothea arrives, she won't be a headstrong runaway girl. She'll be a poor little terrified child, frightened to death at what she has done, and wanting nothing so much as to creep sobbing into her mother's arms and be comforted. If you could only—"
"I'll do anything you tell me."
"It's no use telling, you have to know. It's a case in which you must act by instinct, and not by rule of thumb." In her eagerness to have something to say which would keep conversation away from dangerous themes, she spoke exhaustively on the subject of parental tact, holding well to the thread of her topic, until she perceived that he was not so much listening to what she said as thinking of her. But she had gained her point, and led him to see that Dorothea was to be treated leniently, which was sufficient for the moment. "Now," she finished, rising, "I think I'll take your advice and go and rest till she comes. That's my door, just opposite. I chose the room for its convenience in receiving Dorothea. You'll be sure to call me, won't you, the minute you hear the sound of wheels?" He had sat gazing up at her, but now he too rose. It was a minute at which their common anxiety regarding Dorothea slipped temporarily into the background, allowing the main question at issue between them to assert itself. But it asserted itself silently. He had meant to speak, but he could only look. She had meant to withdraw, but she remained to return his look, with the lingering, quiet, steady gaze which time and place and circumstance seemed to make the most natural mode of expression for the things that were vital between them. What passed thus defied all analysis of thought, as well as all utterance in language, but it was understood by each in his or her own way. To her, it was the greeting and farewell of souls in different spheres, who again pass one another in space. For him, it was the dumb, stifled cry of nature, the claim of a heart demanding its rightful place in another heart, the protest of love that has been debarred from its return by a cruel code of morals, a preposterous convention grown suddenly meaningless to a woman like her and to a man like him. Something like this it would have been a relief to him to cry out, had not the strong hand of custom been upon him and forced him to say that which was far below the pressure of his yearning.
"This isn't the time to talk about what I owe you,"
he said, feeling the insufficiency of his words.
"It's too much to be disposed of in a few phrases."
"On the contrary, you owe me nothing at all."
"We'll not dispute the point now."
"No, but I'd rather not leave you under a misapprehension. If I've done anything tonight, been of any use at all, it's been simply because I loved Dorothea, and it was right. When it was in my power, I couldn't have refused to do it for anyone. For anyone, you understand?"
"Oh, yes, I understand perfectly. But anyone in the same circumstances would feel as I do. No, not as I do," he corrected quickly. "No one else in the world could feel."
"I'm really very tired," she said hurriedly. "I'll go now, but I count on you to call me." He watched her while she glided across the room, but it was only when her door had closed and he had dropped into his seat that he was able to state to himself the fact that the mere sight of her again had demolished all the barricades he had been building in his heart against her for the last 6 months. They had fallen more easily than the walls of Jericho at the blast of the sacred horn. The inflection of her voice, the look from her eyes, the gestures of her hands, had dispelled them into nothingness, like ramparts of mist. But it was not that alone. He was too much a man of affairs not to give credit to the practical abilities she had shown that night. No graces of person or charms of mind or resources of courage could have called forth his admiration more effectively than this display of prosaic executive capacity. What had to be done, she had done, more promptly, wisely, and easily than any man could have accomplished it. She had foreseen possibilities and forestalled accident with a thoroughness which he himself could not have equalled. "My God," he groaned inwardly, "what a wife she would have made for any man! How I could have loved her if it hadn't been for—" He stopped abruptly and leaped to his feet, looking around dazed on the great empty hall, at the end of which a porter slept in his chair, while the clerk blinked drowsily behind his desk. "I do love her," he declared to himself. "All summer long I have uttered blasphemies. I do love her. Whatever she may have been, she shall be my wife." Out on the terrace the cold wind was grateful, and he stood for a minute bareheaded, letting it blow over his fevered face and through his hair. It had risen during the last hour, making the pines rock slowly in the starlight, and swelling their moan into deep sobs. As Derek Prume paced the terrace in strained expectation, he was deceived again and again into the thought that something was approaching. Now it was the champing and stamping of horses toiling up the ascent. Now it was the bray and throb of the automobile. Now it was the voices of men, conversing or calling or breaking into laughter. 20 times he hastened to the steps at the end of the terrace, sure he could not have been mistaken, only to hear the earth forces sob and sough and shout again, as if in derision of this puny, presumptuous mortal, with his evanescent joy and pain. So another hour passed. His mind was not of the imaginative order which invents disaster in moments of suspense, so that he was able to keep his watch more patiently than many another might have done. Once he tried to smoke, but the mere scent of tobacco seemed out of place in this curious world, alive with odd psychical suggestions, and he threw the cigar away into the darkness, where its light glowed reproachfully, like a dying eye, till it went out. It was after 3, when a sudden sound from the driveway struck his ear, but he had been deceived so often that he would pay it no attention. Though it seemed like the unmistakable approach of an automobile, it had seemed so before, and he would not even look round till he had reached the distant end of the terrace. When he turned, he could see through the trees and along the dark line of the avenue the advance of the heralding light. Dorothea had come at last. She was even close upon them. In a few more seconds she would be alighting at the steps. He hurried inside to wake the porter and warn Diane. "She's here," he called, rapping sharply at her door. "Please come, quick." There was a response and a hurried movement from within, but he did not wait for her to appear. When she came out of her room, she could see from the light thrown over the terrace that the motor had already stopped at the steps. Someone was getting out, and she could hear men's voices. Advancing to a spot midway between her room and the main entry, she stood waiting for Derek to bring her his daughter. A moment later, he sprang into the light of the doorway with the features white and alarmed. "Go back," he cried to her with a commanding gesture. "Go back." "But what's the matter?" "Go back," he ordered more imperiously than before. "Oh, Derek, it's Dorothea. She's hurt. I must go to her. I will not go back." She rushed towards the entry, but he caught her and pushed her back. "I tell you, you must go back," he repeated. "It's Dorothea," she cried. "She's hurt. She's killed. Let me go. She needs me." "It isn't Dorothea," he whispered, forcing her over the threshold of her own room, and trying to close the door upon her. "Then what is it?" she begged. "Tell me now. You're hurting me. Let me go. You're killing me." There was no need to say more, for the main door swung open again, and the Marquis de Bienville entered, followed by a porter carrying his valise. At his appearance, Derek relinquished Diane's hand, and Diane herself was so astonished that she stepped plainly into view. Not less astonished than herself, Bienville stopped, stock still, looked at her, looked into the room behind her, looked at Derek with a long, half-amused, comprehending stare, lifted his hat gravely, and passed on. When he had gone, there was a minute of dead silence. With parted lips and awe-stricken eyes, Diane gazed after him till he had spoken to the clerk at the desk and passed on into the darker recesses of the hotel. When she turned toward Derek, he was smiling, with what she knew was an effort to treat the situation lightly.
"Well, this time we've given him something to talk about,"
he laughed bravely. She shrugged her shoulders and spread apart her hands with one of her habitual fatalistic gestures. "I don't mind. He can't do me more harm than he's done already. It's not of him that I'm thinking, but of Dorothea. She hasn't come."
"No, she hasn't come."
The fact had grown alarming, so much so as to make the incident of Bienville's appearance seem in comparison a matter of little moment. Diane remained on the threshold of her room, and Derek in the hall outside, while, for mutual encouragement, they rehearsed once more the list of predicaments in which the young people might have found themselves without serious danger. Diane was about to withdraw, when a man ran down the hall calling, The telephone, for the gentleman." Derek started on a run. Diane followed more slowly. When she reached the office, Derek had the receiver to his ear and was talking.
"Yes, Fulton, go on.
I hear. Who has rung you up? I didn't catch. Miss Marion Grimston. Yes. In Philadelphia at the Hotel Belleville. Yes, I understand. And Miss Dorothea is with her. Good. Did she say how she got there? We'll explain when we get back to New York tomorrow morning. All right. Yes, to lunch. She said Miss Dorothea was quite well and satisfied with her trip. That's good. Well, good night, Fulton. Sorry to have kept you up. He put up the receiver and turned to Diane.
Did you understand?
Perfectly. I think I know what has happened. I can guess.
Then I'll be hanged if I can. What is it?
I'll let them tell you that themselves. I'm too tired to say anything more tonight. She kept close to the office where the clerk was shutting books and locking drawers preparatory to closing.
"You must let me come and thank you," he began.
"You must thank Miss Marianne Grimston," she interrupted, "for any real service. All I've done for you, as you see, has been to bring you on an unnecessary journey."
"For me it has been a journey into truth."
"I'll say good night now. I shall not see you in the morning. You'll not forget to be very gentle with Dorothea, will you? And with him. Good night again. Good night." Smiling into his eyes, she ignored the hand he held out to her, and slipped away into the semi-darkness as the impatient clerk began turning out the lights. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 22. Dacre Prune was guilty of an injustice to the Marquis de Bienville in supposing he would make the incident at Lakefield a topic of conversation among his friends. His sense of honour alone would have kept him from betraying what might be looked upon as an involuntary confidence, even if it had not better suited his purposes to entrust the matter, in the form of an amusing anecdote, told under the seal of secrecy, to Mrs. Bayford. In her hands it was like invested capital, adding to itself, while he did nothing at all. Months of insinuation on his part would have failed to achieve the result that she brought about in a few days' time, with no more effort than a rose makes in shedding perfume. Before Derek had been able to recover from the feeling of having passed through a strange waking dream, before Dorothea and he had resumed the ordinary tenor of their life together, before he had seen Diane again, he was given to understand that the little scene on Bienville's arrival at the Bay Tree Inn was familiar matter in the offices, banks, and clubs he most frequented. The intelligence was conveyed by a score of trivial signs, suggestive, satirical, or over-familiar, which he would not have perceived in days gone by, but to which he had grown sensitive. It was clear that the story gained piquancy from its contrast with the staidness of his life, and his most intimate friends permitted themselves a little covert chaff with him on the event. He was not of a nature to resent this raillery on his own account. It was serious to him only because it touched Diane. For her, the matter was so grave that he exhausted his ingenuity in devising means for her protection. He refrained from even seeing her until he could go with some ultimatum before which she should be obliged to yield. An unsuccessful appeal to her, he judged, would be worse than none at all, and until he discovered arguments which he could not controvert, he decided to hold his peace. Action of some sort became imperative when he found that Miss Lucilla Van Tromp had heard the story and drawn from it what seemed to her the obvious conclusion. "I should never have believed it," she declared tearfully, "if you hadn't admitted it yourself. I told Mrs. Bayford that nothing but your own words would convince me that any such scene had taken place." "Allowing that it did, isn't it conceivable that it might have had an honourable motive?" "Then what is it? If you could tell me that—" "I could tell you easy enough if there weren't other considerations involved. I should think that in the circumstances you could trust me." "Nobody else does, Derek." "Whom do you mean by nobody else? Mrs. Bayford?" "Oh, she's not the only one, if your men friends don't believe in you." "They believe in me, all right. Don't you worry about that." "They may believe in you as men believe in one another, but it isn't the way I believe in people." "I know how you believe in people, if ill-natured women would let you alone. You wouldn't mistrust a thief if you saw him stealing your watch from your pocket." "That's not true, Derek. I can be as suspicious as anyone when I like." "Well, don't you see that your suspicion doesn't only light on me, it strikes Diane?" "That's just it." "Lucilla!" he cried reproachfully. "Well, Derek, you know how loyal I've been to her. It's been harder, too, than you've ever been aware of. For I haven't told you, I wouldn't tell you, one half the thing that people have hinted to me during the past 2 years." "Yes, but who? A lot of jealous women." "It's no use saying that, Derek, because your own actions contradict you. Why did Diane leave your house, if it wasn't that you believed—" "Don't!" He raised his hand to his face, as if protecting himself from a blow. "I wouldn't," she cried, "if you didn't make me. I say it only in self-defence. After all, you can only accuse me of what you've done yourself. Diane made me think at first that you had misjudged her, but I see now that if she had been a good woman, you wouldn't have sent her away." "I didn't send her away. She went." "Yes, Derek, but why?" "That has nothing to do with the question of the discussion." "On the contrary, it has everything to do with it. It all belongs together. I've loved Diane and defended her, but I've come to the point where I can't do it any longer. After what's happened—" "But I tell you, what happened is nothing. If it was only right for me to explain it to you, as I'll explain it to you some day, you'd find you owed her a debt that you never could repay." "Very well, I won't dispute it. It still doesn't affect the main point at issue. Can you yourself, Derek, honestly and truthfully affirm that you look upon Diane as a good woman, in the sense that is usually attached to the words?" "I can honestly and truthfully affirm that I look upon her as one of the best women in the world." "That isn't the point. Louise de la Valliere became one of the best women in the world, but there are some other things that might be said of her. But I'll not argue, I'll not insist. Since you think I'm wrong, I'll take your own word for it, Derek. Just tell me once, tell me without quibble, and on your honour as my cousin and a gentleman, that you believe Diane to be what I've supposed her to be hitherto, and what you know very well I mean, and I'll not doubt it further." For a moment he stood speechless, trying to formulate the lie he could utter most boldly, until he was struck with the double thought that to defend Diane's honour with a falsehood would be to defame it further, while a lie to this pure, trusting, virginal spirit would be a crime. "Tell me, Derek," she insisted. "Tell me, and I'll believe you." He retreated a pace or two, as if trying to get out of her presence. "I'm listening, Derek. Go on. I'm willing to take your word." "Then I repeat," he said weakly, "that I believe her, I know her to be one of the best women in the world." "Like Louise de la Valliere?"
Yes, he shouted, maddened to the retort. Like Louise de la Valliere, and what then? He stood as if demanding a reply. Nothing. I have no more to say. Then I have, and I'll ask you to listen. He drew near to her again and spoke slowly. There were doubtless many good women in Jerusalem in the time of Herod and Pilate and Christ, but not the least held in honour among us today is the Magdalene. That's one thing. And there's something more. There is joy, so we are told, in the presence of the angels of God, plenty of it, let us hope. But it isn't over the 99 just persons who need no repentance, so much as over the one poor, deserted, lonely sinner that repenteth, Lucilla, do you hear? And you know whom I mean. With this, as his confession of faith, he left her to go in search of Diane. He had formed the ultimatum before which, as he believed, she should find herself obliged to surrender. It was a day on which Diane's mood was one of comparative peace. She was engrossed in an occupation which at once soothed her spirits and appealed to her taste. Madame Cochet, the landlady, bewailing the continued illness of her lingère, Diana begged her to be allowed to take charge of the linen-room of the hotel, not merely as a means of earning a living, but because she delighted in such work. Methodical in her habits and nimble with her needle, the neatness, smoothness, and purity of piles of white damask stirred all those housewifely, home-keeping instincts which are so largely a part of every Frenchwoman's nature. Her fingers busy with the quiet, delicate task of mending, her mind could dwell with the greater content on such subjects as she had for satisfaction. They were more numerous than they had been for a long time past. The meeting at Lakefield had changed her mental attitude towards Jerry Prune, taking a large part of the pain out of her thoughts of him, as well as out of his thoughts of her. She had avoided seeing him after that one night, and she had heard nothing from him since. But she knew it was impossible for him to go on thinking of her altogether harshly. She had been useful to him. She had saved Dorothea from a great mistake. She had done it in such a way that no hint of the escapade was likely to become known outside of the few who had taken part in it. She had put herself in a relation towards him which, as a final one, was much to be preferred to that which had existed before. She could therefore pass out of his life more satisfied than she had dared hoped to be with the effect that she had had upon it. As she stitched, she sighed to herself with a certain comfort, when, glancing up, she saw him standing at the door. The nature of her thoughts, coupled with his sudden appearance, drew to her lips a quiet smile. "They shouldn't have shown you in here," she protested gently, letting her work fall to her lap, but not rising from her place. "I insisted," he explained briefly from the threshold. "You can come in," she smiled, as he continued to stand in the doorway. "You can even sit down." She pointed to a chair not far from her own, going on again with her stitching, so as to avoid the necessity for further greeting. "I suppose you wonder what I'm doing?" she pursued, when he had seated himself. "I'm not wondering at that so much as whether you ought to be doing it." "I can relieve your mind on that score. It's a case, too, in which duty and pleasure jump together. The delight of handling beautiful linen is like nothing else in the world." "It seems to me like servants' work," he said bluntly. "Possibly, but I can do servants' work at a pinch, especially when I like it." "I don't," he declared. "But then you don't have to do it." "I mean that I don't like it for you." "Even so, you wouldn't forbid my doing it, would you?" "I wish I had the right to. I've come here this afternoon to ask you again if you won't give it to me." For a few minutes she stitched in silence. When she spoke it was without stopping her work or lifting her head. "I'm sorry that you should raise that question again. I thought it was settled." "Supposing it was, it can be reopened, if there's a reason." "But there is none?" "That's all you know about it. There's a very important reason." "Since when?" "Since Lakefield." "Do you mean anything that Monsieur de Bienville may have said?"
I do.
That wouldn't be a reason for me.
But you don't know.
I can imagine. Monsieur de Bienville has already done me all the harm he can. It's beyond his power to hurt me any more.
But, Diane, you don't know what you're saying. You don't know what he's doing. I hardly know how to put it. He's destroying your reputation.
She glanced up with a smile, ceasing for an instant to sew. You mean he's destroying what's left of it? Well, he's welcome. There was so little of it.
For God's sake, Diane, don't say that. It breaks my heart. You must consider the position that you put me in. After you've rendered me one of the greatest services one person can do another, do you think I can sit quietly by while you are being robbed of the dearest thing in life, just because you did it?
I should be sorry to think the opinion other people hold of me to be the dearest thing in life. But even if it were, I willingly give it up for Dorothea.
It isn't for Dorothea. It's for me.
Well, wouldn't you let me do it for you? I'm not of much use in the world, but it would make me a little happier to think I could do anyone a good turn without being promised a reward.
A reward? Oh, Diane!
It's what you're offering me, isn't it? If it hadn't been for the great service you speak about, you wouldn't be here asking me again to be your wife.
That's your way of putting it, but I'll put it in mine. If it hadn't been for the magnitude of the sacrifice you're willing to make for me, I shouldn't have dared to hope that you loved me. When all pretexts and secondary causes have been considered and thrust aside, that's why I'm here, and for no other reason whatever. If you love me, he continued, why should you hesitate any longer? If you love me, why seek for reasons to justify the simple prompting of your heart? What have you and I got to do with other people's opinions? When there's a plain, straightforward course before us, why not go right on and follow it?
She raised her eyes for one brief glance. You forget. The words were spoken quietly, but they startled him.
Yes, Diane, I do forget. Rather, there's nothing left for me to remember. I know what you'd have me recall. I'll speak of this once more to be silent on the subject forever. I want you to forgive me. I want to tell you that I, too, have repented.
Repented of what?
Of the wrong I've done you. I believe your soul to be as white as all this whiteness around you.
Then, she continued, questioning gently, you've changed your point of view during the last 6 months?
I have. You charged me then with being willing to come down to your level. Now I'm asking you to let me climb up to it. I see that I was a self-righteous Pharisee, and that the true man is he who can smite his breast and say, God be merciful to me, a sinner.
A sinner? Like me?
I don't want to be led into further explanations, he said suddenly, on his guard against insinuations. You and I have said too much to each other not to be able to be frank. Now I've been frank enough. You've understood what I felt at other times. You understand what I feel today. Why draw me out to make me speak more plainly?
I'm not drawing you out, she declared. If I asked you a question or two, it was to show you that not even the woman that you take me for, not even the forgiven penitent, could be a good wife for you. I can't marry you, Mr. Prune. I must beg you to let that answer be decisive. There was decision in the way in which she folded her work and smoothed the white brocaded surface in her lap. There was decision, too, in the quickness with which he rose and stood looking down at her. For a second she expected him to turn from her, as he had turned once before, and leave her with no explanation beyond a few laconic words. She held her breath while she awaited them.
Then that means, he said at last, that you put me in the position of taking all, while you give all.
I don't put you into any position whatsoever. The circumstances are not of my making. They are as much beyond my control as they are beyond yours.
They're not wholly beyond mine. If there are some things I can't do, there are some I can prevent.
What things? His tone alarmed her, and she struggled to her feet.
You're willing to make me a great sacrifice, but at least I can refuse to accept it.
What do you mean? She moved slightly back from him, behind the protection of one of the tables piled breast-high with its white load. "You're willing to lose for me the last vestige of your good name?" "I don't care anything about that," she said hurriedly. "But I do. I won't let you." "How can you stop me?" she asked, staring at him with large, frightened eyes. "I shall tell Dorothea's part in the story." "You'd—" she began with a questioning cry. "All who care to hear it shall. They shall know it from its beginning to its end. They shall lose no detail of her folly or of your wisdom." "You would sacrifice your child like that?" "Yes, like that. Neither she nor I can remain so indebted to anyone as you would have us be to you." "You wouldn't be indebted to me?" "Not to so terrible an extent. If it's a choice between your good name and hers, hers must go. She'd agree with me herself. She wouldn't hesitate for one single fraction of an instant, if she knew. She'd be grateful to you as I am, but she couldn't profit by your magnanimity." "So that the alternative you offer me is this: I can protect myself by sacrificing Dorothea, or I can marry you, and Dorothea will be saved." "I shouldn't express it in just those words, but it's something like it." "Then I'll marry you. You give me a choice of evils, and I take the least." "Oh, then to marry me would be an evil?" "What else do you make it? You'll admit that it's a little difficult to keep pace with you. You come to me one day accusing me of sin, and on another announcing my contrition, while on the third you may be in some entirely different mood about me." "You can easily render me ridiculous. That's due to my awkwardness of expression, and not to anything wrong in the way I feel." "Oh, but isn't it out of the heart that the mouth speaketh? I think so. You've advanced some excellent reasons why I should become your wife, and I can see that you're quite capable of believing them. At one time it was because I needed a home, at another because I needed protection, while today, I understand, it is because I love you." "Is this fair?" "I dare say you think it isn't. Then you haven't been tried and judged half a dozen of times unheard as I've been. I'll confess that you've shown the most wonderful ingenuity in trying to get me into a position where I should be obliged to marry you, whether I would or not. And now you've succeeded. Whether the game is worth the candle or not is for you to judge. My part is limited to saying that you've won. I'm ready to marry you as soon as you tell me when." "To save Dorothea?" "To save Dorothea."
"And for no other reason?"
"For no other reason."
"And of course I can't keep you to your word."
"You can't release me from it except on one condition."
"Which is?"
"That Dorothea's secret shall be kept."
"I must use my own judgment about that."
"On the contrary, you must use mine. You've made me a proposal which I am ready to accept. As a man of honour, you must hold to it or be silent."
"Possibly," he admitted on reflection. "I shall have to think it over. But in that case we'd be just where we were."
"Yes, just where we were."
"And you'd be without help or protection. That's the thought I can't endure, Diane. Try to be just to me. If I make mistakes, if I flounder about, if I say things that offend you, it's because I can't rest while you're exposed to danger. Alone as you are in this great city, surrounded by people who are not your friends, a prey to criticism and misapprehension, when it is no worse, it's as if I saw you flung into the arena among the beasts. Can you wonder that I want to stand by you? Will you be surprised if I demand the privilege of clasping you in my arms and saying to the world, 'This is my wife'? When Christian women were thrown to the lions, there was once a heathen husband who leaped into the rim to die at his wife's side, because he could do no more. That's my impulse. Only I could save you from the lions. I couldn't protect you against everything, perhaps, but I could against the worst. I know I'm stupid. I know I'm dull. When I come near you, I'm like the clown who touches some exquisite tissue spun of azure. But I'm like the clown who would fight for his treasure and defend it from sacrilegious hands and spend his last drop of blood to keep it pure.
It's to be put in a position where I can't do that I fight hard. It's to see you so defenceless. But I'm not defenceless. Why not? Whom would have you? Nobody in this world but me. Oh, yes, I have. Who? He smiled faintly at the fierceness of his brief question. It's no one to whom you need feel any opposition, even though it's someone who can do for me what you cannot. What I cannot? What you cannot, what no man can. Asperges me hyssopo et mundabor. Thou shalt purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Eric, he has purged me with hyssop, even though he has not been in the way you think. The hyssop of what I've had to suffer, he has purged me from so many things, that now I can see I can safely commit my cause to him. So that you don't need me. She looked at him in silence before she replied. Not for defence. Nor for anything else? She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Nor for anything else? He asked again. Her voice was faint, her head sank, her body trembled. But she forced the one word. No. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 23. Mademoiselle has sent for me? Yonville kissed the hand that Miss Grimston, without rising from her comfortable chair before the fire, lifted toward him. The hand-screen with which she shielded her face protected her not only from the blaze, but from his scrutiny. In the same way, the winter gloaming with its uncertain light nerved her against her fear of self-betrayal, giving her that assurance of being mistress of herself which she lacked when he was near. I did send for you. I wanted to see you. Won't you sit down? I've been expecting the summons, he said significantly, taking the seat on the other side of the hearth. Indeed? Why? I thought the day would come when you would be more just to me. You thought I'd hear things? Perhaps. I have. That's why I've asked you to come. During the brief silence before she spoke again, he was able to congratulate himself on his diplomacy. He checked his first impulse to come to her with his great news immediately on his return from Lakefield. He had seen how relatively ineffective the information would be were it to proceed bluntly from himself. He had even restrained Mrs. Bayford's enthusiasm in order to let the intelligence filter gently through the neutral agencies of common gossip. In this way, it would seem to Miss Grimston a discovery of her own, and appeal to her as an indirect corroboration of his word. He had the less scruple in taking these precautions, in that he believed Diane to have justified anything he might have said of her. It was no small relief to a man of honour to know he had not been guilty of a gratuitous slander, even though it was only on a woman. He waited Miss Grimston's next words with complacent expectancy. When they came, they surprised him. I wondered a little why you should have been at Lakefield. I'm afraid you think it was for a very foolish reason, he laughed. But I'll tell you if you want to know. I went because I thought you were there. I? At 3 o'clock in the morning? It was like this, he went on. You'll pardon me if I say anything to give you offence, but you'll understand the reason why. On the day when we all lunched together at the restaurant Blitz, you, Madame your aunt, your friend Monsieur Reggie Bedford, and I was a little jealous of some understanding between you two, in which I was not included. You spoke together in whispers, and exchanged glances in such a way that all my fears were aroused. Afterwards you went away with him. That evening at the Stuyvesant Club I heard a strange rumour. It was whispered from one to another until it reached me. Your friend, Monsieur Bradford, is not a silent person, and what he knows is sure to become common property. The rumour, which I grant you was an absurd one, was to the effect that he had persuaded you to run away and marry him, and that you had actually been seen on the way to Lakefield in his car. I was in his car, that's quite true. Ah, there was some foundation for the report. Madame your aunt will have told you how I hurried here about 11 o'clock that night. You had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but an enigmatic note saying you would explain your absence in the morning. What was that I to think, mademoiselle? I was afraid to think. I didn't stop to think. I determined to follow you. It was too late for any train, so I took an auto. I reached the Bay Tree Inn and saw what I saw. Voila. A smile of amusement flickered over his grey features, but she made no remark. If I was guilty of an indiscretion in following you, mademoiselle, he pursued, it was because of my great love for you. If you had chosen to marry someone else, I couldn't have kept you from it, but at least I was determined to try. I thought it incredible that you should take a step like that, in secrecy and flight. Yet I find so many strange ways of marrying in America that I must be pardoned for my fear. As it is, I cannot regret it, since by a miracle it gave me proof of that which you have found it so difficult to believe. It has grieved me more than I could ever make you understand to know that during all these months you have doubted me. I'm sure of that, she said softly, gazing into the fire. Haven't you wondered where I was that night when you followed me to Lakefield? If I had, I shouldn't presume to inquire. It's a secret, but I should like to tell it to you. I know you'll guard it sacredly because it concerns a woman's honour. She did not look up. She felt the startled toss of the head, characteristic of his moments of alarm. If mademoiselle is pleased to be satirical. No, there's no reason why I should be satirical. If in spite of everything my confidence in you wasn't absolute, I shouldn't risk a name I hold so dear as that of Dorothea Prune. Tiens, he exclaimed under his breath. Miss Prune is a charming girl, but she's been very foolish. What she did was not quite so bad in American eyes as it would be in French ones, but it was certainly very wilful. If you heard rumours of an elopement, it was hers. Mon Dieu! With the big Monsieur Regis? Not quite. I needn't tell you the young man's name. It will be enough to say that the big Monsieur Regis, as you call him, is in his confidence. It was Regis who undertook conveying Dorothea to Lakefield, where she was to meet the bridegroom-elect and marry him. And then? Then Regis told me. It was silly of anyone to entrust him with a mission of the kind, for he couldn't possibly keep it to himself. He told me while we were lunching at the Bliss. That's what he was whispering. That's why I went away with him after lunch and left you with my aunt. I saw you were annoyed. I couldn't help it. You wanted to dissuade him? I tried, but I saw it was too late for that. He wouldn't desert his friend at the last minute. The only concession I could wring from him was that he should let me take his place in the motor. You? I drive at least as well as Mr. Bradford. I made him see that in case of accident it would make all the difference in the world to Miss Prune's future life to be with a woman rather than a man. Did you make her see it too? I didn't try. The arrangement these wise young people had made rendered the substitution easy. Dorothea had apparently considered it part of the romance, not to know with whom she was going, or where she was being taken. At the time and place appointed, she found an automobile, driven by a person in a big fur coat, cap, and goggles. It was agreed that she should enter and ask no questions. And did she? She fulfilled her engagement to the letter. As soon as she was seated, I drove away, and for 6 hours I didn't hear a sound from her. 6 hours? Did it take you all that time to reach Lakefield? I didn't go to Lakefield. I took her to Philadelphia. My one object was to keep her from meeting the young man that night. Perhaps that's where I made my mistake. But why? It's better for her that she shouldn't. Ah, perhaps not for everyone else. You see, I lost my way 2 or 3 times, though, as I've been over the ground twice already, I was always able to right myself after a while. Near Trenton, Dorothea got frightened, and when I peeped inside I could see she was crying. As all danger was over then, I stopped and let her see who I was. Was she angry? Quite the contrary. The poor child was terrified at her own rashness, and very much relieved to find she had been kept from being as foolish as she had intended. I got in beside her, and let her have her cry out in comfort. After that we ate some sandwiches and took heart. It was weird work in the dead of night and along the lonely roads, but we pushed on and crept into Philadelphia between 1 and 2 in the morning. That was a very brave act, mademoiselle. Bienville's eyes glistened, and his face lighted up with an ardour that was not dampened by the casual, almost listless air in which she told her story. It might have been better if I'd let the whole thing alone. Why so? You can really interfere in other people's affairs without doing more harm than good. If I'd let them go their own way, Diane Edith wouldn't have been put in a false position. Ah? That's the other part of the story. If I had known, I should have left the matter in her hands. She would have managed it better than I. As it was, she made my bit of help superfluous. I should find it hard to credit that, he said, twisting his fingers nervously. You won't when I tell you. In the quiet, unaccentuated manner in which she had given her own share in the action, she gave Diane's. Shading her eyes with the hand-screen, she was able to watch his play of feature and note how the first forced smile of bravado faded into an expression of crestfallen gravity. You see, she concluded, they were frantic at Dorothea's failure to appear. When you arrived, they naturally thought it was she. And if Derek Prune hadn't lost his head when he saw you, he wouldn't have tried to thrust her out of sight as though she were caught in a crime. It was so like a man to do it. A woman would have had a dozen ways of disarming your suspicion, while he did the very thing to arouse it. I don't blame you for thinking what you did, not in the least. I don't even blame you for telling it, since it would seem to bear out what you said before. I should only blame you. Yes, mademoiselle, you would only blame me. I should only blame you if, now that you know the truth, you didn't correct the impression you have given. Are you going to begin on that again? He asked in a tone of disappointment. I'm not beginning again because I've never ceased. If I say anything new on the subject, it is this, that it's time the final word was spoken. I agree with you there. It is time for that word. But you must speak it. There was a ring of energy in his voice which caused her to turn from her contemplation of the fire and look at him. When she did, he had taken on a new air of resolution. I think it's time we came to a definite understanding, he went on, and that you should see how the matter looks from my point of view. You speak of doing right, mademoiselle, as if it were an easy thing. You don't realize that for me it would have to be the last act but one in life. In spite of the shock, she ignored his implied confession, going on to speak in the tone of ordinary conversation. The last act but one? I don't understand you. Really, I'm surprised at that. You're so good a sportsman that I could think you'd see that if I do what you ask, there will be only one more thing left for me. For a few minutes she looked at him silently with fixed gaze, taking in the full measure of his meaning. That's folly, she said at last. Is it? Not for me. It might be for some people, but not for me. You must remember who I am. I'm a Frenchman. I'm an aristocrat. I'm a Bienville. I'm a member of a class, of a clan that lives and breathes on honour. I can do without almost everything in the world but that. I can do without money. I can do without morals. I can do without most kinds of common honesty. I can do without nearly all the Christian virtues and still keep my place among my friends. But I can't do without that particular shade of conduct they and I understand by the word honour. Aren't you doing without it as it is? No, because there again our code is special to ourselves. Thus, a crime is not in suspicion or supposition. It isn't even in detection. It's in admission. It's in confession. All sorts of things may be thought of you and said of you and even known of you, and you can bluff them out. But when you have acknowledged them, you're doomed. Even so, isn't it better to acknowledge them and be doomed? That's the question. That's what I have to decide. That's where you must help me decide. If you had allowed me, I should have made up my own mind on my own responsibility. But you won't let me. Now that the incident at Lakefield is no good as evidence, I see that you will never rest until we come to the plainest of plain speech. The problem I've had to solve is this. Is Diane Eveleth to be happy, or am I? Is she to rise while I go under, or shall I keep her down and stay on the surface? Since it's her life or mine, which is it to be? The alternative may be a brutal one, but there it is. And you've decided in your own favour. So far, I've been actuated by the instinct of self-preservation. And are you going to persist in it? That's for you to tell me. But I should like to remind you first of this, that if I don't, I go. And what if I went with you? You couldn't. The journey would be too long. But you needn't go so far if I'm there. I couldn't take you with me. You must understand that. I once knew an American girl who married a man who cheated at cards and buried herself alive with him. I wouldn't let a woman do that for me. But if she wanted to, in that case she ought to be protected from herself. There's no use in ruining two lives where one will do. There's such a thing as losing your life to find it. If so, it's something for me to do alone. Isn't it a kind of moral cowardice to say that? I don't think so. To me it seems only looking things squarely in the face. I'm not the sort of man for whom there's any possibility of beginning life anew. A man like me can't live things down. When once, by his own confession, he has lost his honour, there's no rehabilitation that can make him a man again. Like Cain, he has got to go out from the presence of the Lord. Only, unlike Cain, there's no land of Nod waiting to receive him. There's no place for him anywhere on earth. A few years ago, when I was motoring in the Black Forest with the Daubongues, we dropped into a little hole of an inn as nearly out of the world as anything could be. As we approached the door, a man got up from a bench and shambled away. When he got to what he considered a safe distance, he turned to look at us. I knew him. It was Jacques de la Tour de Lorme. Really? The poor wretch had hidden himself in that God-forsaken spot where he supposed no one would be able to track him down. But we had done it. I've never forgotten his weary gait or the woebegone look in his eyes. It's what would come to me if I waited for it. I don't see why. There's no similarity between the cases. Jacques de la Tour de Lorme did the wrong he could never put right. You'd be doing the very thing he found impossible. He shook his head. It wouldn't make any difference in my world. Nobody there would think of the wrong or the right. They'd only consider what I don't do. It's the confession that would ruin me. Surely you exaggerate. You could do it quietly. No one need know, outside Billy Crewe and 2 or 3 more of us. I don't do things in that way, he said, with an odd return of his old-time pride. If I put the woman right, it shall be in the eyes of the world. I don't ask to have things made easy for me. If I do it at all, I shall do it thoroughly. I'm not afraid of it or of anything it entails. It's a curious thing that a man of my make-up is afraid of being ridiculed or being given the cold shoulder. But he's not afraid to die. But he was looking straight at her. He was too deeply engrossed in his own thoughts to see how proudly her head went up, or to note the flash of splendid light in which her glance enveloped him. I was all ready to die, he pursued in the same meditative tone, that morning in the Pré Catalan. George Eveleth could have had my life for the asking. I'd never know him to miss his mark, and he wouldn't have missed me if he hadn't had another destination for his bullet. I've regretted it more than once. I've had pretty nearly all that life could give me, and I've made a mess of it. You haven't had love, he ventured. Love, he echoed with a short laugh. I've had every kind of love but one, and that I'm not worthy of. We get a good many things we're not worthy of, but they help us just the same. This wouldn't help me, he returned, speaking very slowly. I shouldn't know what to do with it. It would be as useless to me in my new condition as a chaplet of pearls to a slave in the galleys. So, what would you do? I'd do right at any cost. She scarcely knew that the words were spoken, so intent was her thought on the strange mixture of elements in his personality. It was not until she had waited in vain for a response that she found the echo of her speech still in her mental hearing and recognized its import. Her first impulse was to cry out and take it back. She restrained herself and waited. It was an instant in which the love of daring, that was so instinctive in her nature, flew, as it were, a trumpet challenge for the same passion in his own, while they sat staring at each other, wide-eyed and speechless, in the dancing firelight. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 24. On the following day, the Marquis de Bienville found the execution of any intentions he might have had towards Derrick Brune postponed by the circumstance that Miss Regina Van Tromp was dead. The helpless, inarticulate life, which for 3 years had served as a bond to hold more active existences together, had failed suddenly, leaving in the little group the curious impression of collapse. It became perceptible that the hushed sick-room, where Miss Lucilla and Mrs. Eveleth were the only ministrants, had in reality been a centre for those who had never entered it. Now that the living presence was withdrawn, there came the consciousness of dispersing interests, inseparable from the passing away of the long-established, which gives the spirit pause. The days before the funeral became a period of suspended action, in which life refrained from too marked a manifestation of its energies, out of reverence for death. Even when the grave was filled in, and the will read, and the family face to face with its new conditions, there was a respectful absence of hurry in beginning the work of reconstruction. The lull lasted, in fact, till James Van Tromp arrived from Paris, and was broken only then by the banker's desire to get things settled with all possible speed, so that he might return to the Rue Auber. The first sign of real disintegration came from Mrs. Eveleth. She waited for the arrival of the man whom she looked upon now as her confidential adviser, to make the announcement that, since Miss Lucilla would no longer need her, she meant to have a home of her own. The economies she had been able to practice during the last 2 years, together with a legacy from Miss Van Tromp, would, when added to her own income, provide her with modest comfort for the rest of her days. There was something triumphant in the way in which she proclaimed her independence of the daughter-in-law who had been the author of so many of her woes. It was the old banker himself who brought this intelligence to Diane. During the fortnight he had been in New York, he had formed an almost daily habit of dropping in on her. He was the more surprised at his doing so from the fact that her detachment from the rest of the circle of which she had formed a part was now complete. She had gone to see Miss Lucilla with words of sympathy, but her reception was such that she came away with cheeks flaming. Miss Lucilla had said nothing. She had only wept. But she had wept in a way to show that Diane herself, more than the departed Miss Regina, was the motive of her grief. After that, Diane had remained shut up in her linen room, finding in its occupied seclusion something of the peace which the nun seeks in the cloister. There was no one but the old man to push his way into her sanctuary, and for his visit she was grateful. They not only relieved the tedium of her days, but they brought her news from that small world into which her most vital interests had become absorbed. "So the old lady is set up for life on your money," he observed, as he watched Diane hold a white tablecloth up to the light and search it for imperfections. "It isn't my money now, and even if it were, I'd rather she had the use of it. She would have had much more than that if it hadn't been for me.
She might, and then again she mightn't. Who'll tell you what would have happened if everything had been different from what it is? There are people who think they would have had plenty of money if it hadn't been for me, but that doesn't prove they're right. In any case, I'm glad she has it. That's because you're a very foolish little woman, as I told you when you came to me 3 years ago. I said then that you'd be sorry for it some day. But I'm not. Oh, don't tell me. Can't I see with my own eyes? No woman could lose her good looks as you've done and not know she'd made a mistake. How old are you now? I'm 27. Oh, dear me, you look 40. I feel 80. Yes, I dare say you do. Anyone who's got into so many scrapes as you have must feel the burden of time. I don't think I've ever saw a young woman make such poor use of her opportunities. Why didn't you marry Derek Croon? Diane kept herself quite still, her needle arrested halfway through its stitch. She took time to reflect that it was useless to feel annoyed at anything he might say. When she formed her answer, it was in the spirit of meeting him in his own vein. What makes you think I ever had the chance? Because I gave it to you myself. You, Mr. Van Bront? Yes, me. I did all that wire pulling when he first came to New York. I did it just so that you might catch him. Oh? I did, he declared proudly. If you'd been the woman I took you for, you could have had him. But suppose I didn't want him? Oh, don't tell me that, he said pityingly. Why shouldn't you want him? Just as much as he'd want you. Well, I'll put it that way if you like. Suppose he didn't want me. And the more fool he. I picked you out for him on purpose. May I ask why? Certainly. I saw he was getting on in life, and as he'd been a good many years a widower, I imagined he'd had some difficulty in getting anyone to have him. If he's good-looking, he's not what you call very bright. He's got a temper like, well, I won't say what. I pity the woman who got him, that's all, and so you thought you'd pity me? I did pity you as it was. It seemed to me you couldn't be worse off, not even if you married Derek Croon. It was certainly good of you to give me the opportunity, and if I had only known, you would have let it slip through your fingers just the same. You're one of the young women who will always stand in their own light. I dare say now that if I told you I was willing to marry you myself, you would profit by the occasion. I should never want to profit by your loss, Mr. Van Tromp. But suppose I could afford to lose. Unable to answer him there, she held her peace. It was a relief that, before he had time to speak again, a page boy knocked at the door and entered with a card. Diane took it hastily and read the name. Tell the gentleman I can't see him, she said, with a visible effort to speak steadily. Wait, the banker ordered, as the boy was about to turn. Who is it? Without ceremony, he drew the card from Diane's hand and looked at it. Ha! He cried. It's Bienville, is it? Of course you'll see him. Of course you will, of course. Here, boy, I'll go with you. Returning to Gramercy Park after this interview, the banker pottered about his apartment until, on hearing the doorbell ring, he looked out of the window and recognized Derek Croon as his chauffeur. On the stairs as he went down, he heard Miss Lucilla's voice in the hall. "Oh, come in, Derek. Marianne isn't here yet, but she won't be long. I asked you to come punctually because I gather from her note that she wanted to see you very particularly, without Mrs. Bayford's knowledge. She's evidently something on her mind that she wants to tell you." "Hello, dears," the old man interrupted suddenly, as, leaning heavily on the banister, he descended the stairs. "I've got good news for you." "Good news, Uncle James?" Miss Lucas said, reproachfully. With her long, grave face and in her heavy crape, she looked as though she found good news decidedly out of place. "Very best," the banker declared, reaching the hall and taking his nephew and niece each by an arm. "Come into the library and I'll tell you. There," he went on, pushing Miss Lucilla into an arm-chair. "Sit down, Derek, and make yourself comfortable. Now listen, both of you. Perhaps you're going to have a new aunt." "Oh, Uncle James!" Miss Lucilla cried in the voice of a person about to faint. "You're going to be married," Derek roared with the fury of a father addressing a wayward son. "The young woman," the banker went on to explain, "is of French extraction, but Irish on the mother's side." Derek grasped the arms of his chair and half rose, making an inarticulate sound. "Shush, shush," the old man went on, lifting a warning hand. "She's had reverses of fortune, but that wasn't the reason why she came to me. Though her husband had just died, leaving nothing, she had her own dough, on the income on which she had lived. That didn't suit her. Her husband had left a mother who had neither dough nor anything else in the world. At the age of 60, the old woman was a pauper. My little lady came to see me in order to transfer all her own money secretly to her mother-in-law, and face the world herself with empty hands." "My God!" Mary breathed just audibly. Miss Lucilla sat upright and tense, hot tears starting to her eyes. "Lucky, wasn't it?" the uncle went on complacently. "I didn't approve of it at first, but I let her do it in the end, knowing that some good fellow would make it up to her." "Don't joke, uncle," Mary cried nervously. "It's too serious for that." "I'm not joking. It's what I think. And if the world wasn't full of idiots who couldn't tell diamonds from glass, a little woman like that would have been snapped up long ago." Eric sprang up and strode across the room. "Do you mean to tell me," he demanded, turning abruptly, "that she made over all her money to Mrs. Edith, a woman who had deserted her like the rest of us?" "That's what she did. But there's this to be said for the old lady, that she doesn't know it. She thinks it's the wreck of her own fortune, and I wouldn't let me tell her the truth. Since you seem to be interested in the little story," he added with sarcasm, "you may hear all about it." With tolerable accuracy he gave the details of his first interview with Diane, 3 years previous. Long before he finished, Lucilla was weeping silently, while Derek stood like a man turned to stone. Even the banker's own face took on an expression of whimsical gravity as he said in conclusion, "And so I've decided to give her a home. That is," he added significantly, "if no one else will." "Do you mean that from me?" Derek asked, in a tone too low for Lucilla to hear it. "Oh, no, not particularly. I mean it for anyone." "Because," Derek went on, "as for me, I'm not worthy to have her under my roof." The banker made no comment, sitting in a hunched attitude and humming to himself in a cracked voice, while Derek stared down at him. They were still in this position when Marian Grimston was shown in. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 25. Greetings having been exchanged, it was Miss Lucilla's policy to draw her uncle away to some other room, leaving Marian free to have her conference with Froude. But the old man settled himself in his chair again with no intention of quitting the field. Eric, too, entered on the task of dislodging him, but without success. Nursing his knee and peering at Marian with bulgy, short-sighted eyes, the banker kept her answering questions as to Mrs. Playford's health, blind to her obvious nervousness and distress. The cousins exchanged baffled, impatient glances, while Lucilla managed to say in an undertone, "Take Marian to the drawing-room. We'll never get him to go." Eric was about to comply with this suggestion when the footman threw open the library door again. For a moment no one appeared, though a sound of smothered voices from the hall caused the four within the room to sit in strangely aroused expectancy. "Oh, no, I can't go in," came a woman's whispered protest. "You can do it without me." "You must," was the man's response, and a second later Guilloville was on the threshold, standing aside as Diane Eveleth entered. Derek sprang to his feet, but, as if petrified by a sense of his own impotence, stood still. Miss Lucilla, with the instinct of the hostess awake, even in these strange conditions, went forward with her hand half outstretched, and the words "Monsieur de Bienville" on her lips. The old banker rose, and, taking Diane's hand, drew it within his arm in a protecting way, for which she was grateful, while she suffered him to lead her some steps apart. Marian Grimston alone, seated in a distant corner, did not move. With her arm resting on a small table, she watched the rapidly enacted scene with the detachment of a spectator looking at a play. She had thrown back her black veil over her hat, and against the dark background, her face had the grave marble whiteness of classic features in stone. During the minute of interrogatory silence that ensued, Yonville, with a quick reversion to the habits of the drawing-room, was able to re-establish his self-control. With his hat, his gloves, and his stick, he had that air of the casual visitor which helped to give him back the sensation of having his feet on accustomed ground. "I must beg your pardon, Miss Van Tromp, for disturbing you," he said, addressing himself to Miss Lucilla, who stood in the foreground. "I shouldn't have come so if I hadn't something of great importance to say." His voice was so calm that Miss Lucilla could not do otherwise than reply in the same vein of commonplace formality. "Very glad to see you, Monsieur Bienville. Won't you sit down? I was just going to ring for tea." "Thank you," he said, with a wave of the hand that declined without words the proffered entertainment. "Perhaps I had better say what I have to say and go." "Oh, do you think so?" Having fulfilled her necessary duties as mistress of the house, she felt at liberty to fall back, leaving Bienville isolated in the doorway. "Mr. Prune," he said, after further brief hesitation, "I come to make a confession which can scarcely be a confession to anyone in this room but you." Eric grew white to the lips, but remained motionless, while Bienville went on. "On the way up from South America last spring, I said certain things about a certain lady which were not true. I said them first out of thoughtless folly, but I maintained them afterward with deliberate intent. When I pretended to take them back, I did so in a way which, as I knew, must convince you further." "It did." As he brought out the two words, Derek tried to look at Diane, but she was clinging to the arm of old James Van Tromp, while her frightened eyes were riveted on Bienville. "I'm telling you the truth today," Bienville continued, "partly because circumstances have forced my hand, partly because someone whom I greatly respect desires it, and partly because something within myself, I might almost call it the manhood I've been fighting against, has made it imperative. I've come to the point where my punishment is greater than I can bear. I'm not so lost to honour as not to know that life is no longer worth the living when honour is lost to me." He spoke without a tremor, leaning easily on the cane he held against his hip. "I must do myself the justice to say that the wrong of which I was guilty had its origin, at the first, in a sort of inadvertence. I had no intention of doing anyone irreparable harm. I was taking part in a game, but I meant to play it fairly. The lady of whom I speak would bear me out when I say that the people among whom she and I were born, in France, in Paris, engage in this game as a sort of sport, and we call it love. It isn't love in any of the senses in which you understand it here. We give it a meaning of our own. It's a game that requires the combination of many kinds of skill, and if it doesn't call for a conspicuous display of virtues, it lays all the greater emphasis on its own few stringent rules. Like all other sports, it demands a certain kind of integrity, in which the moralist could easily pick holes, but which nevertheless constitutes its saving grace. Well, in this game of love I beat it. I said one day that I had won when I hadn't won. I said it to people who welcomed my victory, not through friendship for me, but from envy of her." The perspiration began to stand in beads upon Bienville's forehead, but he held himself erect and went on with the same outward tranquillity. His eyes were fixed on Prune's, and Prune's on his, in a gaze from which even the nearest objects were excluded. In the little group in which we lived, her position was peculiar. She was both within our gates and without them. While she was one of us by birth, she was a stranger by education and by marriage. She was admitted with a welcome, and at the same time with a question. She was a mark for enmity from the very first. There was something about her that challenged our institutions. And among our worn-out passions and moribund ideals, she brought a freshness we resented. She made our prejudices seem absurd in contrast with her own sanity, and showed our moral standards to be rotten by the light of the something clear and virginal in her character.
can't tell you how this effect was brought about. But there were a few of us who weren't aware of it, as there were a few of us who didn't hate it. There was but one impulse among us to capture in a fault a maker no better than ourselves. The daring of her innocence afforded us many opportunities, and we made use of them. One man after another confessed himself defeated. Then came my turn. I wasn't really defeated. I was put to utter rout with ridicule and scorn. That was too much for me. I couldn't stand it, and I lied. Basil, that will do, Brian cried out in a pleading wail. Don't say any more. I'm not sure that there's any more I need to say. The rest can be easily understood. Everyone knows how a man who lies once is obliged to lie again, and yet again, unless he frees himself, as I do. When I began, I thought I had it in me to go on heroically, but I hadn't. I can't keep it up. I'm not one of the master villains who command respect from force of prowess. I'm a weakling in evil, as in good, fit neither for God nor for the devil. But that's my affair. I needn't trouble anyone here with what only concerns myself. It's too late for me to make everything right now, but I'll do what I can before, he stammered on. I'll write to the people. There were only a few of them, to whom I actually used the words I did. I'll ask them to correct the impression I have given. I know they'll do it when they know. He stopped helplessly. The lustre died out of his eyes, and his pallor became sallowness. But I've said enough, he began again, making a tremendous effort to regain his self-mastery. You can have no doubt as to my meaning, and you will be able to fill in anything I may have left unspoken. Now, he added, sweeping the room with a look, now I'd better go.
Oh, by God, you infernal scoundrel, shouted Mary Croon. You shall not go.
All the suffering of months shot out in the red gleam of his eyes, while the muscular tension of his neck was like that of an infuriated mastiff. In 3 strides he was across the room, with clenched fist uplifted. Vioviol had barely time to fold his arms and stand with feet together and head erect, awaiting the blow. Go on, he said, as Derek stood with hand poised above him. Go on. There was a second of breathless stillness. And slowly the clenched fingers began to relax, and the open hand descended softly, gently, on Vioviol's shoulder. Between the two men there passed a look of things unspeakable, till, with bent head and drooping figure, Derek wheeled away. I'll say good-bye, now. Vioviol's voice was husky, but he bowed with dignity to each member of the company in turn, and to Marian Grimston last. Oh! The name arrested him as he was about to go. He looked at her inquiringly. Oh! She said again, without rising from her place. I promised that if you ever did what you've done today, I would be your wife. You did, he answered, but I've already given you to understand that I'd claim no such reward. It isn't you who will be claiming the reward. It's I. I've suffered much. I've earned it. The very fact that you've suffered much would be my motive in not allowing you to suffer more. Raoul, no man knows the sources of a woman's joy and pain. How can you tell from what is to save me? There's one thing from which I must save you. From uniting your destiny with that of a man who has no future. From pouring the riches of your heart into a bottomless pit where they could do no one any good. Thank you, mademoiselle, with all my soul. I've asked you many times for your love. Of the hard things I've had to do today, the hardest is to give it back to you. Now, when at last you offer it. Don't add to my bitterness by urging it on me. Raoul, she cried, raising herself up, you don't understand. We regard these things differently here from the way in which you do in France. It may be true, as you say, that in losing your honour you've lost all, in French eyes. But we don't feel like that. We never look on anyone as beyond redemption. You should consider that a man who has been brave enough to do what you've done today has gone far to establish his moral regeneration. You can honour him in certain ways, Raoul.
almost more than if he had never done wrong at all. None of us would condemn him or cast a stone at him. Should we, Lucilla? Should we, Mr. Prue? No, no, Miss Lucilla sobbed. We pity him. We take him to our hearts. She's right, young Bill, Derek muttered, nodding towards Marion. Better do just as she says. I'm a Frenchman. I'm a Neoville. I can't accept mercy. But you can bestow it, the girl cried passionately. Anyone would tell you that after all that has happened, after this, I should be happier in sharing your life than in being shut out of it. I appeal to you, Miss Lucilla. I appeal to you, Diane. Can any woman be proud to be the wife of Raoul de Bonville after what he's done this afternoon, no matter how the world turns against him? These ladies, in the goodness of their hearts, might say anything they chose, but nothing would alter their conviction that for you to be my wife would be only to add misery to mistake. That's so, the old banker corroborated, smacking his lips. But you wouldn't be much worse when you've done that than you are now. So why not just let her have her way? Emil tried to speak again, but his dry lips refused to frame the words. No, but impossible. Drag you down, came incoherently from him, when by a quick backward movement he stepped over the threshold into the semi-obscurity of the hall. The act was so sudden that a second had already elapsed before Marion Grimston uttered a cry that rent her like the wail of some strong primordial creature without the power of tears. I will come back. With rapid motion she glided across the room and was in the hall. I'll come back. She descended the hall and had almost reached him as he opened the door to pass out. Raoul, I love you. The door closed as, falling against it, she sank to the floor. Before Miss Lucilla and James Van Tromp could reach her, she was already losing consciousness. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Inner Shrine by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 26. Oh, stay where you are. I'll go. Derek spoke with the terse command of subdued excitement, almost pushing Diane back, as she too attempted to go to Marion's assistance. She sank obediently into one of the great chairs, too dazed even for curiosity as to what was passing in the hall. Derek closed the door behind him, and though confused sounds of voices and shuffling feet reached her, she gave them but a dulled attention. It was not till he came back that her stunned intelligence revived sufficiently to enable her to think. He closed the door again, throwing himself weary into another of the big leathern chairs. They've taken her into Lucilla's room. She'll be all right now. It was better that it should end like that. I'm not so sure. I'm afraid for him. Oh, he'll survive it. You don't know our Frenchmen. They're not like you nor any of you men. Their sensitiveness to honour and their indifference to moral right, it's difficult for you to understand them. I shouldn't be surprised at anything he might do. I'll go and see him tomorrow and try to knock a little reason into him. If it isn't too late. Oh, I dare say it will be. Everything seems to be too late. It's better that something should come too late rather than not at all. What things do you mean? I suppose I mean the same things as you do. He gave a long sigh that was something of a groan, slipping down in his chair into an attitude not of informality, but of dejection. For the moment neither was equal to facing the great subject that must be met. I wonder what Emil will do to himself, he asked suddenly, changing his position with nervous brusqueness, leaning forward now with his elbows on his knees. I wish you'd go and see him tonight. Well, perhaps I will. I have a good deal of fellow feeling with him. I can't help thinking that he and I are in much the same box, and that he has shown me the way out. Eric! She sprang up with a cry of alarm, standing with hands crossed on her breast in a sudden access of terror. Oh, don't be afraid, he laughed, grimly staring up at her. I'm not his sort. There are no heroics about me. Under my stamp don't make theatrical exits. We're too confoundedly sane. Whether we do well or whether we do ill, we plod along on our treadmill round from the house to the office, and from the office to the grave,
So we've never had anything on the conscience. But if I had the spirit of Bienville, you know what I should do? No, 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 she burst out. Don't say it, don't say it. And I won't. But if Bienville thought of it, why shouldn't I? What has he done that is worse than what I've done? What has he done that's as bad? After all, you were little or nothing to him, when you were everything to me. I knew you as he didn't know you. I'd lived in one house with you, watched you, studied you, tried you, put you to tests that you never knew anything about, and had seen you come through them successfully. I'd seen how you bore misfortune. I'd seen how you carried yourself in difficult situations. I'd seen the skill with which you ruled my house, and the wisdom with which you were more than a mother to my child. I'd seen you combine with all that is most womanly the patience and fortitude of a man. It wasn't enough for me. It wasn't enough for me. He threw himself back into his seat with a desperate flinging out of the hands, letting his arms drop heavily over the sides of his chair, and his fingers touched the floor. My God, he groaned ironically. It wasn't enough for me. I doubted her. I doubted her on the first idle word that came my way. I did more than doubt her. I hated her into my court, and tried her, and condemned her, and, as nearly as might be, put her to death. I, with my 100,000 sins, all of them as black as Erebus, are not pure enough for me. Or to make one die of laughter. Diane, he went on in another tone, a tone of ghastly jocularity, did it amuse you, knowing yourself to be what you are, knowing what you had done for Mrs. Evelyn, knowing the thing Bienville had just said of you? Didn't it amuse you to see me sitting in judgment on you? It doesn't amuse me to see you sitting in judgment on yourself, doesn't it? I don't think it would. It seems to me that if I saw a man who had done me so much harm visited with such awful justice as I am getting now, it would make up to me for nearly everything I have had to suffer. In my case, it only adds to it. I wish you wouldn't say these things. If you ever did me wrong, I always knew it was a mistake. Oh, Lord! Oh, Lord! He laughed outright, getting up from his chair and dragging himself heavily across the room, where, with his hands in his pockets and his back against the bookshelves, he stood, facing her. What do you think of Bienville's attitude towards Marian Grimston? He asked, with an inflection that would have sounded casual if it had not been for all that lay behind. I can understand it. I think he was wrong. You think he ought to allow her to marry him? Weighing one thing with another? Yes. Would you marry a man who had shown himself such a hound? It would depend. On what? Oh, on a good many things. Such as? He hesitated a minute before deciding whether or not to walk into his trap. But as his eyes were on the ground and she felt stronger than a minute or two ago, he decided to do it. It would depend, for one thing, on whether or not I loved him. And if you did love him? Again she hesitated, before making up her mind to speak. It would depend on whether or not he loved me. She had given him his chance. The word he had never uttered must now come now or never. For an instant he seemed about to seize his opportunity, but when he actually spoke it was only to say, Would you marry me? No, he gave her answer firmly. No? No. Why? She shrugged her shoulders and threw out her hand, and said nothing in words. Is it because I haven't expressed regret for all the things I have to regret? She shook her head. Because if it is, he went on, I haven't done it only for the reason that the utmost expression would be so inadequate as to become a mockery. When a man has sinned against life, as I've done, no mere cries of contrition are going to win him pardon. That must come as a spontaneous act of grace, as it wells out of the heart of the Most High. Or it can't come at all. That isn't the reason. Then there's another one. Yes, another one. One that's insurmountable? Yes, as things are, it's insurmountable. The look of dumb, unresenting, sadness, he turned away, and, leaning on the mantelpiece, stood with his back towards her and his face buried in his hands. A minute went by in silence. When he spoke, it was over his shoulder, as it were, parenthetically. "But Diane, I love you." He stood as he was, listening, but as if without much expectation, for a response. When none came, and he turned round inquiringly, he beheld in her that radiant change which was visible to those who saw the martyred Stephen's face as he gazed straight into heaven. For a long minute he stood spellbound and amazed. "Was it that?" he asked in a whisper. She gave him no reply. "It was that," he declared in the tone of a man making a discovery. "It was that." "Why did you tell me so before?" he found strength to say. "Tell you, Diane? What was the use of telling you when you knew? My life has been open for you to look into as you would." "Yes, but not to go into. There's only one key that unlocks the inner shrine of all. The word you've just spoken. A woman knows nothing till she hears it." He looked at her with the puzzled air of a man getting strange information. "Well," he said after a long pause, "you've heard it. So what? Now?" "Now, I'm going to say that I love you." "Well, I know that already," he returned. "A man doesn't need to be told what he can see. That isn't what I'm asking. What I want to learn is not what you feel, but what you'll do." She smiled faintly. "I'm asking what you'll do," he repeated. "If you insist on my telling you that," she said, glancing up at him shyly, "I'll say that since the inner shrine is unlocked at last, I'll go in." "Then come. Come." He stood with arms open, his tone of petition still blended with the suggestion of command, as she crossed the room toward him. End of chapter 26. End of The Inner Shrine by Basil King.